There's a book that Carl Jung kept hidden from the world for over 50 years. A manuscript so dangerous, so psychologically explosive, that he locked it away in a vault and forbade its publication until long after his death. This wasn't some academic oversight or modest withholding of incomplete work. No, Jung knew exactly what he had created. He called it his Liber Novus, his Red Book, and within its hand-illuminated pages lies a map of human transformation that contradicts everything you've been taught about spiritual awakening. I want you to imagine for a moment that everything you believe about enlightenment, about consciousness evolution, about becoming your higher self, imagine all of it is backwards. Imagine that the spiritual teachers, the gurus, the meditation apps, the manifestation coaches, they've all been pointing you in precisely the wrong direction. Not because they're malicious, but because they themselves don't understand the fundamental architecture of the psyche. They're selling you ascension when what you actually need is descent. They're promising you light when your soul is drowning in darkness, desperate for you to finally look down instead of up. Carl Jung discovered something that terrified him during his own psychological crisis, what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. He descended into the depths of his own psyche and found that spiritual evolution isn't about transcending your humanity. It's about integrating it. Every rejected part, every shadow fragment, every piece of yourself you've been taught to overcome or rise above. These aren't obstacles to enlightenment. They are enlightenment. They are your soul, dismembered and scattered across the unconscious, waiting for you to gather the pieces and become whole. The Red Book documents Jung's deliberate descent into what he termed creative illness, a controlled psychological breakdown where he dialogued with autonomous figures from his unconscious mind. He met a wise old man named Philemon. He encountered a feminine figure called Salome. He descended into medieval castles and ancient crypts, not in physical space, but in psychic space, which Jung discovered was just as real and perhaps more important than the material world you're sitting in right now. And what he brought back from those depths wasn't a message of love and light. It was a warning. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. This is the secret doctrine Jung hid in his private journals. Spiritual awakening, real soul evolution, begins with a death. Not a metaphorical death, not a comfortable shedding of old beliefs, but a genuine psychological dismemberment where the person you thought you were must be violently torn apart so that something more authentic, more whole, can emerge. The Greeks called it sparagmos, ritual dismemberment. The alchemists called it mortificatio, the killing of the old form. Jung called it individuation, and he knew that most people would rather remain asleep their entire lives than face what individuation actually requires. So why did he hide it? Because Jung understood that this knowledge is dangerous in the wrong hands. If you're not psychologically prepared, if your ego structure is too fragile, if you mistake the map for the territory, this process can destroy you. It can trigger psychosis. It can shatter your personality beyond recovery. It can leave you lost in the unconscious, with no thread back to consensus reality. Jung himself nearly didn't make it out. He wrote that he was menaced by a psychosis, and only his commitment to his family and his patients kept him tethered to the world while he explored those depths. But here's what Jung also discovered. If you don't consciously choose this descent, your psyche will eventually force it upon you. The soul doesn't ask permission. It doesn't wait for you to be ready. When the time comes for transformation, it will use depression, anxiety, illness, crisis, relationship collapse, existential despair, whatever weapon necessary to break apart the false structures of your ego and drag you down into the underworld where the real work happens. You're watching this video because somewhere in your psyche, something is stirring. You've felt it, haven't you? That strange emptiness, despite having everything you thought you wanted. Those synchronicities that seem too perfect to be coincidence. That increasing inability to play the social roles that used to come so easily. The dreams that wake you at 3 in the morning with their impossible intensity. The sudden, inexplicable rage at people you love. The feeling that reality itself is becoming more symbolic, more meaningful, more alive in ways you can't explain to anyone without sounding insane. These aren't signs that something is wrong with you. These are symptoms. And symptoms, in Jungian psychology, are the psyche's language, the only way your soul knows how to get your attention when you've been ignoring it for decades. What modern psychiatry calls disorders, Jung called initiations. What therapy tries to cure, individuation requires you to integrate. The question isn't whether you're experiencing these symptoms. The question is, do you have the courage to understand what they mean? Over the next 3 hours, I'm going to reveal 9 specific symptoms that indicate your psyche is undergoing soul evolution. These aren't pleasant symptoms. They won't feel like spiritual progress. In fact, they'll feel more like spiritual emergency, psychological crisis, or complete personality collapse. But I promise you this, if you can learn to recognize these symptoms for what they are, not pathology but transformation, if you can learn to work with them instead of medicating them away or spiritually bypassing them, you will undergo a metamorphosis that most human beings never even know is possible. Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But he left out the terrifying part. Becoming who you truly are requires destroying who you think you are. It requires facing the darkness you've spent your entire life running from. It requires integrating the evil you've projected onto others back into yourself. It requires dying before you die so that you can finally actually live. This is not a comfortable journey. This is not self-help. This is psychological alchemy, and alchemy, as Jung discovered, is about transformation through fire, dissolution through water, death through earth, and rebirth through air. The alchemists weren't trying to turn lead into gold. They were trying to turn the unconscious human into the conscious human. They were trying to birth the self from the fragments of the ego. So I'm asking you right now, before we go any further, are you ready for this? Because once you see what I'm about to show you, once you recognize these symptoms in yourself, once you understand that your suffering has been purposeful all along, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to unconscious living. You can't return to the comfortable lies you've been telling yourself about who you are and why you're here. If you're still here, if something in you is saying yes, despite the fear, despite the ego's desperate attempt to close this tab and go back to scrolling, then you're ready. You're one of the few. You're one of the souls who chose to incarnate during this particular era of collective transformation because you knew on some level before you were born that you would be called to this work. You knew you would be asked to descend so that others might learn it's safe to do the same. Jung kept the Red Book hidden because humanity wasn't ready. But something has shifted. The collective unconscious is erupting into consciousness on a global scale. What Jung did individually, voluntarily as a pioneer, millions are now being forced to do whether they understand it or not. The symptoms are accelerating. The old structures are collapsing. The false selves are dying. And if you're experiencing what I'm about to describe, you're not going crazy. You're going conscious. You're not falling apart. You're coming together for the first time. This is the secret doctrine Jung hid in his private journals. Your soul has been buried alive beneath the persona you built to survive. And now it's clawing its way back to the surface. The 9 symptoms I'm about to reveal are the sounds of your soul breaking through the concrete of your conditioning. The question isn't whether you'll undergo this process. The question is whether you'll do it consciously or unconsciously, as a hero or as a victim, as an initiate or as a casualty. Let's begin. Let's descend. Let's discover what your symptoms are trying to tell you about who you're becoming, because I'm about to reveal something that will change how you see every crisis you've ever experienced. What if every spiritual teacher lied to you and the real path to soul evolution requires you to become everything you've been taught to transcend? Before we explore the 9 symptoms of soul evolution, we need to confront the single greatest obstacle preventing most seekers from actually transforming: spiritual bypassing. This is the enemy you don't see coming because it disguises itself as progress. It wears the mask of enlightenment while secretly serving the ego's desperate need to avoid pain, growth, and genuine transformation. Let me tell you about Marcus. On the surface, Marcus was the embodiment of spiritual success. He'd spent 10 years in various ashrams across India and Nepal. He could meditate for 6 hours straight. He'd memorized the Bhagavad Gita, studied with multiple gurus, and developed a significant following on social media where he shared profound insights about transcending the ego and resting in pure awareness. His bio read, "Beyond the mind, beyond the self, just presence." People traveled across the country to attend his weekend retreats. He seemed to radiate peace. But Marcus had a secret. Every time he went home to visit his family, he would have panic attacks in the car on the way there. His mother's voice, just her voice, would trigger such intense anxiety that he'd sometimes turn around and cancel the visit entirely. His younger brother, who'd never shown any interest in spirituality, would make a casual joke at dinner, and Marcus would feel a rage so volcanic that he'd have to excuse himself and do rapid breathwork in the bathroom just to avoid exploding. For 10 years, Marcus told himself this was because his family was still stuck in ego consciousness. They hadn't done the work. They didn't understand. They were trapped in their unconscious patterns, and being around them was pulling him out of his high vibration. So he minimized contact, surrounded himself with fellow seekers, and continued teaching about transcendence. Until the day his father died suddenly of a heart attack. Marcus flew home for the funeral, and something inside him cracked open. Sitting in his childhood bedroom, surrounded by the physical evidence of a life he'd spent a decade fleeing, he finally allowed himself to feel what he'd been avoiding. He was still 8 years old, still desperate for his father's approval, still carrying the wound of never being good enough, never being seen, never being chosen. All the meditation, all the spiritual practices, all the teachings about non-attachment, none of it had touched this core wound. He hadn't transcended his pain. He'd just gotten really, really good at dissociating from it. This is spiritual bypassing, and it's epidemic in modern consciousness culture. Jung identified this pattern decades before the term was invented. He called it identification with the spiritual archetype, or inflation by the self. What he meant was this: the ego, terrified of its own smallness and fragmentation, will latch onto spiritual concepts and experiences as a way to avoid the actual work of integration. Instead of descending into the personal shadow, all the rage, shame, fear, and trauma that got repressed during childhood, the seeker leaps upward into transpersonal states. They use meditation to bypass grief. They use love and light to avoid confronting their capacity for cruelty. They use concepts like "we're all one" to escape the difficult work of developing healthy boundaries and individuated personhood. The spiritual bypass is seductive because it provides genuine experiences of expanded consciousness. Marcus really did have moments of egoless awareness during meditation. He really did access states of profound peace. But these states became escape hatches, not integration tools. He was using spirituality the same way an addict uses substances, to avoid feeling the unbearable feelings, to escape the intolerable reality of his wounded humanity. Jung was brutally clear about this in his private writings. He wrote, "The main interest of my work is not concerned with the treatment of neuroses, but rather with the approach to the numinous. But the fact is that the approach to the numinous is the real therapy, and inasmuch as you attain to the numinous experiences, you are released from the curse of pathology." Read that carefully. The approach to the numinous, to the sacred, to the divine, to expanded consciousness is real therapy. But notice what Jung says. It's the approach to the numinous that heals, not the escape into it. The difference is everything. Approaching the numinous requires you to bring your whole self, shadows and all, into contact with the sacred. Escaping into the numinous means you leave your wounded parts behind, unintegrated, and they continue to run your life from the unconscious. Here's how you know if you're spiritually bypassing. You can talk eloquently about enlightenment concepts, but your actual relationships are a disaster. You preach unconditional love but can't maintain a romantic partnership longer than 6 months. You post about inner peace while medicating your anxiety with constant spiritual content consumption. You judge others for being unawakened while avoiding therapy for your unresolved trauma. You use spiritual language to gaslight people who call out your harmful behavior. That's just your ego talking, or you're creating your own suffering by resisting what is. The spiritual bypass creates what Jung called the persona of the sage. It's a mask, an elaborate identity constructed around being awakened, and it serves the same function as any other persona: protection. The ego is terrified that if you look beneath the spiritual mask, you will discover you're not enlightened at all. You're just wounded, just human, just one more person stumbling through existence trying to avoid pain. But here's the dark secret about spiritual bypassing that nobody talks about. It works. At least it works for a while. You really can use spiritual practices to create a buffer between yourself and your suffering. You really can construct a life where you're surrounded by people who speak the same spiritual language, where your persona is constantly reinforced, where you never have to face the rejected parts of yourself because you've agreed to mutually ignore each other's shadows in exchange for maintaining the collective fantasy of awakening. This is why spiritual communities are often hotbeds of unprocessed shadow material. You get groups of people who've all agreed to play the game of evolved consciousness, while their actual shadows, the competition, the power dynamics, the sexual manipulation, the financial exploitation, rage beneath the surface unchecked. And when someone finally points it out, when someone breaks the unspoken agreement and says, "Hey, this guru is actually abusing people," or "this community has a cult dynamic," the group turns on the truth teller viciously. Why? Because the truth teller is threatening to collapse the entire elaborate structure of bypass that everyone has invested in. Jung saw this pattern in every spiritual movement he studied. The same shadow dynamics that govern unconscious society also govern spiritual communities. They're just dressed in different language. The dictator becomes the guru. The propaganda becomes the teachings. The violence becomes aggressive compassion or wrathful enlightenment. The sexual exploitation becomes sacred sexuality or tantric practice. The financial manipulation becomes energy exchange or abundance consciousness. None of this means spirituality itself is the problem. Jung was deeply spiritual. He spent his entire career exploring the numinous, the transpersonal, the archetypal realm. But he insisted, and this is crucial, that genuine spirituality can only emerge from psychological honesty. You cannot skip the shadow work. You cannot leapfrog over your personal unconscious straight into cosmic consciousness. Or rather, you can try, but what you'll create is spiritual inflation, not spiritual maturity. Let me share something personal here. I spent years teaching Jungian psychology before I recognized my own spiritual bypass. I thought because I was doing the work of analyzing dreams, exploring mythology, studying archetypes, I thought I was integrating my shadow, but I was using Jungian concepts the same way Marcus used meditation, as sophisticated armor against vulnerability. I could intellectually map my psyche, label my complexes, identify my projections, but I wasn't actually feeling the feelings beneath them. I was dissecting my psychology at a safe distance rather than living through the transformation. It took a relationship ending, really ending, not the amicable conscious uncoupling I'd tried to frame it as, for me to see what I'd been doing. My partner looked at me and said, "You talk about integration, but you've never once let me see you fall apart. You've never once stopped analyzing long enough to just be broken with me." And she was right. I'd been using Jung the same way some people use Buddhism or Advaita Vedanta, as a way to maintain control, to stay in my head, to avoid the messy, humiliating collapse that actual vulnerability requires. The spiritual bypass is your soul's greatest enemy because it's so convincing. It provides all the language of transformation without requiring any actual death of the false self. It lets you believe you're evolving while you're actually just rearranging the furniture in your psychological prison. So how do you know if you're really doing the work versus bypassing? Jung offered a brutal litmus test. Look at your life, not your peak experiences, not your mystical states, not your conceptual understanding. Look at your actual lived existence. Are you more capable of intimacy than you were 5 years ago or less? Are your relationships deepening, or do you keep starting over with new people who don't know your patterns? Can you tolerate conflict without spiritualizing it away? Can you feel grief without immediately trying to transcend it? Can you admit when you're wrong without defending yourself with spiritual concepts? The spiritual bypass collapses the moment you stop using spirituality to feel better and start using it to become real. This is the difference between what Jung called the inflation of the ego by identification with the self versus the ego serving the self. In the first case, you're using spiritual experiences to inflate your sense of importance. I'm enlightened, I'm awakened, I'm evolved beyond these mundane concerns. In the second case, you're allowing your small ego to be shattered and reformed in service of something larger than itself, which requires accepting your ordinariness, your woundedness, your absolute equality with every other struggling human. Here's the uncomfortable truth about soul evolution that spiritual bypassing helps you avoid. It's not majestic. It's not Instagram-worthy. It doesn't look like someone meditating peacefully on a mountaintop. It looks like someone sobbing on their bathroom floor at 2 in the morning, finally allowing themselves to feel the childhood grief they've been running from for 40 years. It looks like apologizing to someone you hurt instead of explaining how they manifested the experience. It looks like staying in the relationship through the difficult conversation instead of deciding they're not aligned with your vibration. It looks like admitting you don't have the answers instead of performing certainty. The spiritual bypass promises you can become enlightened without becoming humble. Soul evolution requires the opposite. You must become humble before you can become whole. You must descend into the valley of your ordinary human brokenness before you can integrate the mountain peak experiences of the numinous. As Jung wrote, the descent into the depths always seems to precede the ascent. So, if you recognize yourself in this chapter, if you see the ways you've been using spirituality to avoid psychology, using transcendence to avoid integration, don't despair, don't beat yourself up. The spiritual bypass isn't evidence that you're failing at spiritual evolution. It's often the first stage of spiritual evolution. It's what happens when the psyche gets its first taste of expanded consciousness, but doesn't yet have the ego strength to integrate it. You have to build the bypass before you can recognize it as a bypass. You have to construct the spiritual persona before you can see through it. The question isn't whether you've been spiritually bypassing. Most sincere seekers have at some point. The question is, now that you see it, are you willing to do something different? Are you willing to stop ascending and start descending? Are you willing to stop transcending your humanity and start inhabiting it? Are you willing to trade the fantasy of enlightenment for the reality of wholeness? Because here's what Jung discovered that the Red Book ultimately reveals. You are not here to escape the human condition. You're here to become fully conscious within it. You're not here to transcend your darkness. You're here to illuminate it. And that illumination, that making darkness conscious, that's the actual path of soul evolution. The 9 symptoms I'm about to reveal, they're what happens when the bypass finally breaks down, when the soul stops tolerating your spiritual inflation and forces you into the real work, when the psyche says, enough performing, enough pretending, enough using my language to avoid my demands. It's time to actually transform. Comment below. What spiritual practice have you used to avoid feeling pain? What enlightenment concept have you hidden behind instead of facing your actual wounds? This isn't about shame, it's about recognition, because recognizing the bypass is the first step in dismantling it, and dismantling it is the first step in soul evolution. The path forward requires you to become willing to be ordinary before you can become extraordinary. Willing to be broken before you can become whole, willing to descend into your personal hell before you can ascend to your personal heaven. As Jung said, no tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. Your roots are calling. It's time to stop floating in spiritual fantasy and sink into psychological reality. It's time to stop bypassing and start becoming. Before we navigate the 9 symptoms of soul evolution, you need a map, not a metaphorical map, but an actual cartography of the psyche, the hidden architecture Jung spent his entire career exploring. Because here's what most people don't understand. The psyche isn't random. It has structure, layers, autonomous forces, and an inherent drive toward wholeness that Jung called the transcendent function. Your symptoms aren't chaos. They're your psyche reorganizing itself according to a blueprint older than human civilization. Imagine your consciousness as an island. The part of the island you can see, the beaches, the palm trees, the structures you've built, that's your ego. It's your conscious identity, your sense of I. It's the you that wakes up in the morning and thinks, this is me, this is my life. These are my preferences and beliefs and goals. The ego is necessary. Without it, you'd have no center of consciousness, no way to navigate reality, no capacity to make choices. But here's what Jung discovered. The ego is not in charge. It's not the master of your psyche. It's more like the captain of a ship who believes he controls the vessel, not realizing there's an entire ocean beneath him, dictating where he can actually go. Just below the surface of your island, the part you can't see but which shapes everything, that's your personal unconscious. This is the repository of everything you've experienced but repressed, forgotten, or never fully processed. All the childhood memories your ego couldn't handle, so it buried them. All the emotions you weren't allowed to feel, so you split them off. All the aspects of yourself that didn't fit your family's expectations or society's demands, so you shoved them into the darkness. Jung called these rejected parts shadow, not because they're evil, but because they're unconscious. They're the parts of you operating in darkness, influencing your behavior without your awareness. But go deeper. Descend beneath your personal unconscious, beneath your individual experiences and memories, and you encounter something vast and ancient, the collective unconscious. This isn't your trauma or your repressed desires. This is the psyche you share with all humanity, the archetypal realm where the fundamental patterns of human experience exist as autonomous forces. The hero, the mother, the father, the trickster, the wise old man, the anima, the animus, the self. These aren't just symbols or metaphors. In Jung's understanding, they're actual psychic entities with their own intelligence, their own agendas, their own power to possess and transform human consciousness. Think of it this way. Your ego is like a small flashlight beam of consciousness moving across an enormous dark landscape. Most of your psyche is in darkness, not because it doesn't exist, but because your conscious awareness can only illuminate one small area at a time. Soul evolution is the process of expanding that flashlight beam, bringing more and more of the unconscious into consciousness, until eventually you can hold the tension between ego and self, personal and collective, light and dark, without splitting into one-sided identification with either pole. Jung called this process individuation. The word is crucial, not individualism, which is ego inflation, but individuation, which means becoming an integrated individual. It means differentiating from the collective, from mass consciousness, from groupthink, from unconscious identification with family complexes or cultural conditioning. But simultaneously, it means integrating the collective unconscious, recognizing that you contain all archetypes, all human potentials, all opposites within your psyche. This is the paradox Jung discovered. To become truly individual, you must first recognize you're not just individual. You're a node of consciousness in a vast collective psyche. You're personal and transpersonal, unique and universal, separate and connected. Most people never reach this paradox because they remain identified with either the ego or the unconscious. They're either rigid individuals cut off from their depths, or they're overwhelmed by the unconscious with no ego strength to contain it. Individuation is learning to stand in the tension between both. Now, Jung mapped this process through the lens of medieval alchemy. This isn't mystical nonsense. Alchemy was a symbolic language for psychological transformation that predated modern psychology by centuries. The alchemists weren't literally trying to turn lead into gold. They were using chemical metaphors to describe spiritual metamorphosis, and Jung cracked the code. The alchemical stages perfectly map the process of individuation. The first stage is nigredo, the blackening, the death, the descent into darkness. This is where most people are when they first experience the symptoms we're about to explore. Everything that once gave life meaning has turned to ash. The persona cracks, the shadow erupts, the ego's constructions collapse. In alchemical imagery, this is the putrefaction, the rotting away of the old form so something new can emerge. It feels like depression, like crisis, like everything falling apart. But Jung insisted this isn't pathology. It's the necessary first death. You cannot transform what hasn't first been destroyed. The second stage is albedo, the whitening, the purification. After the darkness, a strange new clarity emerges. You begin to see your patterns with brutal objectivity. The projections you've been casting onto others become visible. The unconscious material that's been running your life starts to surface. This is the stage of uncomfortable truth, of recognizing how asleep you've been, how much of your life has been automatic, conditioned, unconscious. The alchemists called this washing, cleaning away the false identity to reveal what's underneath. The third stage is citrinitas, the yellowing, the dawn, the first light of integration. This is when genuine insight starts to penetrate. You're no longer just seeing your shadow. You're beginning to integrate it, to reclaim its energy. The split between conscious and unconscious starts to heal. New capacities emerge. There's a quality of gold appearing, not as a permanent state, but as glimpses of what wholeness might feel like. The alchemists depicted this as the rising sun, the light breaking through after the long night. The final stage is rubedo, the reddening, the sacred marriage, the union of opposites. This is Jung's conjunctio, the integration of masculine and feminine principles within the psyche, what he called anima and animus, the reconciliation of conscious and unconscious, ego and self, personal and collective. The alchemists showed this as the chemical wedding, two opposite forces merging to create something new. This isn't a permanent achievement. It's a capacity that must be renewed continually throughout life. But once you've touched it, once you've experienced genuine psychic integration, you can never fully regress to unconscious existence. Here's the critical understanding. These stages aren't linear. You don't complete Negredo and move on forever. Soul evolution spirals. You'll experience death and rebirth, dissolution and reintegration, descent and ascent multiple times throughout your life. Each cycle goes deeper, integrates more material, expands consciousness further. It's like climbing a mountain in a spiral path. You pass the same landmarks, but each time from a higher elevation. Now let me give you a metaphor for the whole process, because this is abstract, and your psyche thinks in images. Imagine your soul is a seed, not a metaphorical seed, an actual seed with tremendous potential buried deep in the soil of your unconscious. Your ego, your conscious identity, is the surface soil, the part exposed to light and air. You've spent your whole life building things on the surface, career, relationships, achievements, persona. But beneath all that construction, that seed has been germinating in darkness. At some point, often triggered by crisis, but sometimes spontaneously, that seed begins to sprout. Its roots break through the compacted soil of your conditioning. Its shoot pushes upward, cracking through the concrete of your ego structures. This is violent. It's destructive. From the surface perspective, it looks like everything is falling apart. But from the seed's perspective, from the soul's perspective, this is necessary growth. The concrete must crack. The structures must shift. Otherwise, the seed dies without ever becoming the tree it was meant to be. Your symptoms, the 9 symptoms we're about to explore, these are the roots breaking through. These are the shoots cracking the concrete. Your ego experiences them as crisis because from its perspective, the stable world is collapsing. But your soul experiences them as emergence, as finally being allowed to grow after decades of containment. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But here's what most people miss in that quote. Who you truly are isn't who you currently think you are. It's not your ego identity, your personality, your accomplishments, or your carefully curated self-concept. Who you truly are is that seed, the self with a capital S, which Jung described as the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious unified. The self is already whole. It's already integrated. It's already individuated. Your lifetime is spent removing the obstacles between your ego and yourself, dissolving the false barriers you erected for protection so that authentic wholeness can finally shine through. This is why Jung insisted individuation isn't about becoming someone new. It's about becoming who you've always been beneath the personas, beneath the conditioning, beneath the protective structures of the ego. It's archaeology, not construction. You're not building a self. You're excavating the self that was buried under layers of familial, cultural, and personal defenses. But here's the terrifying part, and this is why most people unconsciously resist individuation even when they consciously seek it. Becoming who you truly are requires destroying who you think you are. The ego must die, not literally, but its identification with itself as the totality of your being must shatter. You must experience directly that you are far more than your conscious identity. that vast forces move through your psyche beyond your control, that what you call I is a temporary emergence from an ocean of unconsciousness. This is ego death in the Jungian sense, not the dissolution of the ego. You need a functional ego to navigate reality, but the death of ego inflation, the death of ego identification, the death of the fantasy that you're the master of your psyche rather than its servant. As Jung said, the experience of the self is always a defeat for the ego. Let me be clear about something crucial. This process cannot be forced. You cannot simply decide to individuate and make it happen through willpower. Individuation happens to you, not by you. Your job isn't to control it, it's to cooperate with it. It's to recognize when your psyche is trying to transform you and stop resisting. Stop medicating the symptoms. Stop spiritually bypassing the darkness. Stop fleeing from the crisis that's actually your soul's emergence. The architecture of soul evolution Jung discovered has a built-in intelligence. Your psyche knows what needs to be integrated and in what order. Your dreams will bring you exactly the material you're ready to process. Your shadow will erupt precisely when you have enough ego strength to contain it without being destroyed. Your synchronicities will appear when your conscious attitude aligns with unconscious currents. You don't have to engineer this. You just have to stop sabotaging it. So when I reveal the 9 symptoms, understand them as signs that your psyche is reorganizing itself according to this ancient blueprint. These symptoms aren't random afflictions. They're the psyche's communication system saying, Nigredo is here. Death is necessary. Let the old form dissolve so the new form can emerge. They're saying, albedo is beginning. See clearly now. Don't look away from what's being revealed. They're saying, integration is possible. The split can heal, but only if you stop clinging to the fragments and allow the wholeness. Jung gave us the map, the stages of alchemy, the structure of the psyche, the process of individuation. But he also gave us a warning, and I want you to hear this clearly before we go further. He said, the serious problems in life are never fully solved. If ever they should appear to be so, it is a sure sign that something has been lost. The meaning and purpose of a problem seem to lie not in its solution, but in our working at it incessantly. Soul evolution isn't a destination. You don't complete individuation and retire as an enlightened being. You don't integrate your shadow once and never see it again. You don't achieve wholeness and maintain it forever without effort. The process is lifelong, cyclical, deepening with each spiral. And that's not a bug, it's a feature. Because consciousness itself is never static. Every new experience, every new relationship, every new phase of life brings new unconscious material to integrate, new aspects of self to discover, new deaths and rebirths to undergo. The architecture Jung revealed shows us that the psyche has an inherent drive toward wholeness, what he called the transcendent function. Just like the body has an immune system that automatically fights infection, the psyche has a self-regulating mechanism that automatically seeks integration. But unlike the body, which can heal itself without conscious cooperation, the psyche requires your conscious participation. You have to witness the process. You have to feel the feelings. You have to allow the transformations. Otherwise, the psyche will keep creating symptoms, escalating the crisis until you finally pay attention. This is the secret map Jung left us. Not a rigid path, but a living process. Not a destination, but an orientation. Not a formula, but a framework for understanding what's happening when your life feels like it's falling apart. Because what looks like falling apart from the ego's perspective looks like coming together from the self's perspective. What feels like destruction is actually construction. What seems like death is actually birth. Your soul has been buried alive beneath the structures you built to survive. And now, whether you consciously chose it or not, Whether you feel ready or not, it's breaking through. The seed is sprouting. The concrete is cracking. The old form is dying so the new form can emerge. The 9 symptoms I'm about to reveal are your psyche's language. They're how the unconscious speaks when words fail. They're how the soul gets your attention when you've been ignoring it for decades. They're how transformation announces itself before the conscious mind understands what's happening. You're not going crazy. You're going conscious. You're not falling apart. You're coming together for the first time. You're not experiencing pathology. You're experiencing metamorphosis. This is Jung's secret map, the architecture of soul evolution, and you're standing at the threshold, whether you realize it or not. The question isn't whether the process will unfold. It already is. The question is whether you'll recognize it, cooperate with it, and allow yourself to be transformed by it, or whether you'll fight it, medicate it, and spend the rest of your life wondering why you feel so hollow despite doing everything right. The symptoms are coming. Let's learn to read them. The first symptom of soul evolution arrives like a thief in the night, stealing everything you thought gave your life purpose. You wake up one morning and nothing matters anymore. Not your career that you spent years building, not your relationships that once felt essential, not your goals, your dreams, your carefully constructed future. Everything you've been working toward suddenly feels hollow, absurd, like you've been running on a treadmill that's going nowhere, and you just now noticed. This isn't depression, not in the clinical sense, though psychiatry will often diagnose it as such. This is what Jung called the confrontation with the unconscious, where the ego's constructed reality begins to crumble because the soul can no longer tolerate living in the false world you've created. The meaning structures you've depended on, achievement, status, validation, security, even love, they reveal themselves as insufficient, as ego constructions that can no longer contain the emerging self. Let me tell you about Sophia. She was 34, a partner at a prestigious law firm, married to a successful architect, living in a beautiful home with a social circle that most people would envy. On paper, her life was perfect. She had achieved everything her family had hoped for, everything society promised would make her happy. But something happened that no one could explain, least of all Sophia herself. She was in the middle of a high-stakes deposition, the kind of moment she used to live for, where her sharp mind and quick wit would dominate the room. She was performing brilliantly as usual, demolishing the opposing counsel's argument piece by piece. And then, in the middle of a sentence, she stopped. Not because she lost her train of thought, but because a question appeared in her mind with such force that it paralyzed her. Why am I doing this? What is the actual point of any of this? She excused herself, went to the bathroom and stared at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her, polished, professional, powerful, suddenly seemed like a stranger. No, worse than a stranger. She seemed like a fiction, a character Sophia had been playing for so long that she'd forgotten it was a performance. And underneath the crushing question was an even more terrifying realization. She had no idea who she actually was beneath the role. That night, Sophia told her husband she needed to take a few days off, but a few days became a few weeks, and a few weeks became a sabbatical, and eventually she never went back to the firm. Her husband was supportive at first, then confused, then frustrated, then angry. "What do you want?" he kept asking, and Sophia's answer was always the same. "I don't know. I just know that everything we've been doing feels meaningless." What Sophia was experiencing is the first symptom of soul evolution, the collapse of meaning. Jung encountered this in his own life during his break with Freud. He wrote, "I felt totally suspended in midair, for I had not yet found my own footing." Everything he'd built his identity around, his relationship with Freud, his theories, his position in the psychoanalytic community suddenly felt inadequate. The old meanings had died, and the new meanings hadn't yet emerged. He was in the void, the gap, the terrifying space between who he'd been and who he was becoming. This symptom is devastating because humans are meaning-making creatures. We can survive almost any suffering if we can find meaning in it. But when meaning itself collapses, when the very frameworks that organized your reality disintegrate, you experience a kind of death that's worse than physical death. It's existential death, the death of the world as you've understood it. Here's what's actually happening beneath the surface. Your soul is rejecting the life your ego built. For years, maybe decades, you've been living according to other people's definitions of success, happiness, purpose, your family's expectations, society's values, cultural conditioning about what makes a life worthwhile. You internalized all of this unconsciously, built an entire existence around it, and now your psyche is saying, this isn't yours. This isn't authentic. This isn't who you actually are, and I will no longer support the false structure. The collapse happens in stages. First, external validation systems stop working. The promotion that should have felt triumphant feels empty. The accomplishment that should have brought satisfaction brings nothing. The praise that used to fuel you now slides off like water. Your ego keeps performing the motions, but there's no genuine feeling underneath. You're going through life on autopilot, and somewhere deep inside, you know it. Second, relationships begin to feel performative. You sit at dinner with friends and realize you're saying things you don't mean, laughing at jokes that aren't funny, maintaining conversations about topics you don't care about. The intimacy feels hollow because you're not actually present. You're playing the role of yourself, and increasingly, you can't remember why you signed up for this performance. Third, your belief systems start to fracture. The religion you were raised with, the political ideology you identified with, the philosophical framework you organized your worldview around, they all reveal themselves as insufficient. Not necessarily wrong, but incomplete. They don't touch the questions that are emerging from your depths. They don't address the hunger that's growing in your soul. They are answers to questions you're no longer asking. Fourth, future-oriented thinking collapses. You can't connect with your 5-year plan anymore. Career goals that once motivated you now feel arbitrary. Retirement fantasies feel absurd. Why spend 30 years doing something you hate so you can finally do what you want when you're old? The entire structure of delayed gratification, of sacrificing present authenticity for future security, becomes intolerable. And finally, the most disorienting stage. Even the things you genuinely loved start to feel meaningless. Your hobbies, your passions, the activities that used to bring joy, they all flatten into a gray sameness. It's not that you're incapable of pleasure. You are. But pleasure isn't enough anymore. Your soul is demanding something deeper than pleasure, something more substantial than happiness. It's demanding meaning itself, and it won't settle for the ego's substitutes. This is where Sophia found herself. Everything she'd built her life around, achievement, status, marriage, success, had become background noise. She could still perform the functions, but there was no soul in it. She described it to her therapist like this. It's like I've been watching a movie of my life, and suddenly I realized I'm not the main character. I'm not even in the movie. I'm just the person sitting in the theater and the person on screen. That successful lawyer, that good wife, that accomplished woman, she's someone else entirely. Now, here's what makes this symptom so dangerous and so sacred at the same time. Most people, when they hit this phase, immediately try to escape it. They change jobs, thinking a new career will restore meaning. They end relationships, thinking a new partner will reignite passion. They move to a new city, travel the world, take up extreme hobbies, have affairs, make dramatic life changes. anything to escape the void. But the void follows them, because the void isn't external, it's internal. It's not that your life lacks meaning, it's that your ego's capacity to create meaning has been exhausted. You've run out of convincing stories to tell yourself about why you're here and what you're doing. And no external change can fix that, because the problem isn't your circumstances. The problem is that you've outgrown the consciousness that created those circumstances. Jung was clear about this. The confrontation with the unconscious must be seen not only in terms of danger and pathology, but as a meaningful crisis that can lead to a higher integration of personality. The key word is meaningful. The crisis itself is meaningful. The collapse is purposeful. It's not random chaos, it's targeted destruction. Your psyche is dismantling the false meanings so that authentic meaning can emerge. But here's the catch. Authentic meaning can't be constructed by the ego. It can only be discovered through descent into the unconscious. It can only emerge from the self, from the deeper layers of the psyche that the ego has been ignoring. Which means you can't think your way out of this symptom. You can't read the right book, take the right course, or adopt the right philosophy and suddenly have meaning restored. You have to do something far more terrifying. You have to surrender to the meaninglessness. You have to consent to not knowing. You have to let the old world die completely before the new world can be born. This is the nigredo phase of alchemy, the blackening, the putrefaction, the death. The alchemists knew that you couldn't transform base metal into gold without first breaking down the original substance completely. You had to reduce it to prima materia, to primordial chaos, before you could begin the reconstruction. The same is true of consciousness. You can't transform your ego into an integrated self without first allowing the ego's world to collapse into meaninglessness. Most people don't make it through this phase. They medicalize it, medicate it, or make impulsive changes to escape it. They tell themselves they're depressed and need antidepressants, or they tell themselves they need a radical life change and blow up their marriage, quit their job, or move across the country. Both responses abort the process, because the process isn't about fixing the external circumstances or adjusting brain chemistry. It's about allowing the psyche to reorganize itself at a fundamental level. Jung himself barely made it through his confrontation with the unconscious. He wrote, "An incessant stream of fantasies had been released, and I did my best not to lose my head, but to find some way to understand these strange things. I stood helpless before an alien world. Everything in it seemed difficult and incomprehensible." He was a trained psychiatrist, one of the most brilliant minds of his era, and even he felt overwhelmed by the collapse of his old meaning structures. But he discovered something crucial. The way through wasn't around. It wasn't escape. It was descent. He began deliberately engaging with the unconscious through what he called active imagination, dialoguing with the figures that appeared in his fantasies, allowing the unconscious to speak in its own language of symbols and images. He stopped trying to maintain control and started trying to understand. He stopped resisting the collapse and started witnessing it. And slowly, over months and years, new meaning began to emerge. Not meaning he constructed, but meaning that revealed itself. The symbols started to cohere into patterns. The chaos started to show its underlying order. The death started to prepare the ground for rebirth. But it required patience, courage, and above all, the willingness to endure the void without prematurely filling it with false meanings. This is what Sophia eventually learned. After months of drifting, of sitting with the emptiness, of resisting the urge to make dramatic changes or adopt new identities, something shifted. She started having dreams, powerful, vivid dreams that felt more real than her waking life. In one recurring dream, she was standing in a vast library, and every book she pulled from the shelves was blank. At first this terrified her, but eventually she understood. The blank pages weren't absence. They were possibility. They were the space where her own story could finally be written, not the story her family wanted or society expected, but the story her soul had been waiting to tell. She started painting, something she hadn't done since childhood. She had no training, no talent in any conventional sense, but something in her needed to create images to express what words couldn't capture. The paintings were dark, chaotic, unsettling, pure negredo, but they were authentic in a way nothing else in her life had been for years. Her marriage didn't survive. Her husband couldn't understand what was happening to her, and Sophia realized she'd married him as part of the performance, not from genuine soul connection. The divorce was painful, but it was clean. There was no bitterness because there had never been real intimacy to betray. They'd been playing roles together, and now the play was over. What Sophia discovered is what Jung tried to tell us. The collapse of meaning isn't the end, it's the beginning. It's the psyche's way of saying everything you've built has been in service of a false self. Now that structure must die so your true self can emerge. The pain isn't pathology, it's labor. It's the birth canal of the soul. Here's the framework for working with this symptom. I call it the meaning dissolution protocol. Stage 1, recognition. Stop diagnosing yourself as broken. Recognize that the collapse of meaning is a symptom of soul evolution, not mental illness. This doesn't mean you shouldn't seek support. Therapy can be invaluable during this phase. But find a therapist who understands depth psychology, who can help you engage with the process, rather than simply trying to restore your previous functioning. Stage 2. Resist false solutions. Don't make major life changes impulsively. Don't adopt new belief systems because they promise to restore meaning. Don't fill the void with new relationships, new addictions, or new personas. The void is necessary. Let it be what it is. Stage 3. Engage the unconscious. Start a dream journal. Pay attention to synchronicities. Practice active imagination. Dialogue with the feelings and images that emerge from your depths. Your unconscious is trying to communicate. Create space to listen. Stage 4. Symbolic expression. Find ways to express what you're experiencing through art, writing, movement, music, anything that bypasses the rational mind and speaks the language of the psyche. You're not trying to create something good or impressive. You're trying to give form to the formless, to make the invisible visible. Stage 5. Trust the process. This is the hardest part. You have to trust that the psyche knows what it's doing. You have to trust that the death is purposeful, that new meaning will emerge, that the void isn't permanent. This trust can't be manufactured through positive thinking. It's developed through witnessing the process and seeing that your psyche is indeed reorganizing itself toward wholeness. If you're in this phase right now, if nothing feels meaningful anymore, if you've lost connection to everything that used to organize your life, I want you to hear this. You're not broken. You're not failing. You're not lost. You're in the most sacred phase of transformation. Your soul is rejecting the false life your ego built, and that rejection feels like death because it is death, the death of who you thought you were. But death, in the Jungian understanding, is never the end. It's always preparation for rebirth. The seed must die before the tree can grow. The caterpillar must dissolve before the butterfly can emerge. Your old self must collapse before your true self can be born. The void you're in right now, it's not emptiness, it's potential. It's not absence, it's pregnant nothingness, waiting for the authentic you to finally emerge. But you can't force it, you can't rush it. You can only surrender to it, witness it, and trust that something is happening beneath the surface that your conscious mind can't yet comprehend. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But before you can become who you truly are, You must stop being who you falsely were. And that cessation, that stopping, feels like the collapse of meaning. Because the old meanings were built around the false self, and they must dissolve before authentic meanings can emerge from the true self. Comment below if you're experiencing this. Write the word void if everything feels meaningless right now. Not for attention, not for sympathy, but for recognition. Because recognition is medicine. Knowing you're not alone in the void, knowing it's not pathology but transformation, knowing that others have walked this darkness and emerged transformed, that knowledge itself can be the thin thread that keeps you tethered while your old world collapses. You're not going crazy, you're going conscious, you're not falling apart. You're coming together for the first time, and the meaninglessness you're experiencing, it's not the end of meaning, it's the death of false meaning so that authentic meaning can finally be born. Stay in the void, witness the death, trust the process. Something is happening, something profound, something sacred. Your soul is emerging, and it's destroying everything that isn't authentically you to make room for what is. The first symptom of soul evolution is the collapse of meaning, and it's the most important symptom of all because it creates the space, the terrible, necessary, sacred space, for everything that follows. After the collapse of meaning, after you've descended into the void and stopped clinging to the old stories, something strange begins to happen. The boundary between your inner world and outer world starts to blur. Coincidences that would normally seem random begin to feel orchestrated. Numbers repeat everywhere you look. A song you were just thinking about plays on the radio. You dream about someone you haven't thought of in years, and they call you the next day. The universe itself seems to be speaking to you in a language of symbols, and you can't tell if you're going crazy or waking up. This is the second symptom of soul evolution, synchronicity storms. And they're not random. They're evidence that your psyche is reorganizing reality itself. Jung coined the term synchronicity to describe what he called meaningful coincidences, events connected not by causality but by meaning. Two things happen simultaneously or in close sequence, and while there's no logical explanation for their connection, the meaning is undeniable. Most people experience occasional synchronicities, little winks from the universe that make you pause and wonder. But during soul evolution, synchronicities don't just increase, they storm, they cascade, they become so frequent and so specific that you can't dismiss them, and you can't ignore what they're trying to tell you. Let me tell you about David. David was a corporate accountant, 42 years old, living what he called a life of quiet desperation, Thoreau's phrase, which he'd read in college and never forgotten. For 20 years, he'd been crunching numbers in a gray cubicle, methodically climbing a ladder he didn't actually want to climb. His father had been an accountant. His grandfather had been an accountant. David was simply fulfilling the family template, never questioning whether it was actually his path. But his father had died 6 months earlier, and something in David had cracked open. Not grief exactly. His relationship with his father had been distant, respectful but not intimate. It was something else, a question that wouldn't leave him alone. What did my father actually want? What dreams did he bury to maintain the family tradition? David discovered an old box in his father's garage while cleaning out the house. Sketches, dozens of them, architectural drawings of buildings that were never built. His father had wanted to be an architect. This was the unfulfilled dream, the road not taken, the life his father had sacrificed to maintain financial security for his family. And David was now living the same sacrifice, making the same choice his father had made. Then the synchronicities started. David was sitting in a coffee shop, wrestling with the question of whether he should quit his job and finally pursue what he actually loved. He'd always been drawn to carpentry, to working with his hands, to creating physical objects instead of manipulating spreadsheets. As he sat there, paralyzed by indecision, a song came on the cafe's speakers, "The Carpenter" by the Avett Brothers. David had never heard it before, but the lyrics were about choosing authenticity over security, about building something real with your own hands. He laughed it off as coincidence, but when he got in his car, the same song was playing on the radio, a different station, but somehow the exact same song at the exact same moment he turned on the ignition. The hair on his arms stood up. That night he dreamed of his father. In the dream, his father was younger, happier than David had ever seen him in life. He was standing in an empty field, holding a hammer and blueprint, and he looked at David and said, "Build what I couldn't." David woke up with tears on his face. The next morning, driving to work, David saw a truck in front of him. The license plate read, "Build it now, build it now." 3 synchronicities in less than 24 hours, all pointing to the same message, all answering the question he'd been too afraid to ask out loud. But it didn't stop there. Over the next 3 weeks, David experienced what he could only describe as a synchronicity storm. He'd be thinking about his father, and a stranger would start a conversation about unfulfilled dreams. He'd be contemplating whether to quit, and he'd open a book at random to a page about taking courageous action. Numbers started appearing. His father's birthday, 6/14, showed up everywhere. On receipts, timestamps, address numbers, phone calls. It was 6/14 when he had the dream. It was 61:40 at the grocery store. It was building 614 where he had a meeting. Most people would dismiss this as pattern-seeking behavior, as the brain's tendency to find meaning in randomness. And David tried to. He's a rational man, trained in logic and linear thinking. But the synchronicities were too specific, too timely, too meaningful to be pure chance. They weren't just coincidences, they were communications. Something in the depths of his psyche was trying to get his attention, and it was using external reality as its messenger. This is what Jung discovered that revolutionized psychology. The unconscious doesn't just speak through dreams and symptoms, it speaks through the world itself. There's a porousness between psyche and matter that becomes visible during periods of transformation. Jung called this the psychoid realm, a domain where psyche and matter aren't separate but interpenetrate, where inner states can influence outer events in ways that defy mechanistic causality. He developed this concept after years of witnessing synchronicities in his own life and in his patients' lives. The most famous example occurred during a therapy session with a young woman who was highly rationalistic, locked in her intellectual defenses, unable to access her deeper emotions. She was recounting a dream about a golden scarab beetle, and at that exact moment, a real scarab beetle, extremely rare in Switzerland, tapped against Jung's office window. He caught it and handed it to her, saying, "Here is your scarab." The synchronicity shattered her rational defenses and opened her to the transformation she'd been resisting. Jung spent decades trying to understand how this was possible. He corresponded with Wolfgang Pauli, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, exploring whether quantum mechanics might provide a framework for understanding synchronicity. What they discovered is this: at the quantum level, observation affects reality. Consciousness and matter aren't separate, they're entangled. And if that's true at the microscopic level, why couldn't it be true at the macroscopic level during periods of intensified psychic transformation? Jung called synchronicity an acausal connecting principle, events connected by meaning rather than by cause and effect. But here's what makes this profound. Synchronicities don't happen randomly. They cluster around moments of psychological transformation, when your psyche is reorganizing itself at a fundamental level, when unconscious contents are trying to break through into consciousness. when you're standing at a threshold between the old self and the new self. That's when synchronicities storm. Why? Because during these liminal periods, your unconscious is at maximum intensity. It's flooding consciousness with symbols, archetypes, autonomous complexes demanding attention. And when the unconscious reaches that level of activation, it doesn't just affect your inner world, it affects your perception and experience of the outer world. The boundary between subject and object becomes permeable. The psychoid realm becomes accessible. And suddenly, the universe itself seems to be conspiring to communicate with you. Now, here's where this gets dangerous, and I need to say this clearly. Synchronicity storms can trigger psychosis in people whose ego structure isn't strong enough to contain the experience. If you don't have sufficient grounding in consensus reality, if you're already prone to magical thinking or paranoid ideation, if your ego boundaries are too weak, synchronicities can become overwhelming. You can start believing you're the center of some cosmic drama, that everything happening everywhere is about you, that you have supernatural powers or special knowledge. This is psychotic inflation, and it's a real risk. Jung was adamant about this. He said synchronicities must be approached with the greatest caution and the most critical judgment. You have to maintain your grounding in ordinary reality, even while experiencing extraordinary correspondences. You have to hold the tension between "this is meaningful" and "I don't know what it means." You have to resist the temptation to inflate, to believe you're special or chosen, to construct an entire metaphysical system around your personal synchronicities. The synchronicity interpretation system I'm about to share is designed to help you navigate this without losing yourself. This isn't about divination or trying to manipulate reality through magical thinking. It's about learning to read the language your unconscious speaks when it can't reach you through normal channels. Stage 1. Recognition without inflation. When a synchronicity occurs, acknowledge it. Feel the numinous quality, the sense of meaning, but don't immediately jump to conclusions about what it means. Don't inflate its significance beyond the immediate. Simply note, something meaningful just happened. My psyche is trying to communicate. Stage 2. Context analysis. Look at what was happening in your inner world when the synchronicity occurred. What question were you holding? What emotion were you feeling? What decision were you wrestling with? Synchronicities don't happen in a vacuum. They respond to your psychological state. The meaning is always relational, always in dialogue with what's happening inside you. Stage 3. Symbol amplification. Take the symbol that appeared, the song, the number, the encounter, the dream, and amplify it. What does this symbol mean culturally, historically, personally? What associations arise when you sit with it? Don't settle for the first meaning that appears. Go deeper. Let the symbol reveal its layers. Stage 4. Pattern recognition. A single synchronicity is interesting. A cluster of synchronicities pointing to the same theme is a message. Track them. Keep a synchronicity journal. Look for patterns over days and weeks. What is the consistent thread? What is your unconscious persistently trying to bring to your attention? Stage 5. Integration through action. This is crucial. Synchronicities aren't just messages to receive, they're invitations to act. Your unconscious is trying to move you in a particular direction, to help you make a choice, to push you through a threshold you're hesitating at. The synchronicity's purpose is to provide the final push, the confirmation you needed. Honor that by taking action aligned with the message. David did exactly this. After 3 weeks of synchronicity storms, after every sign pointing to the same conclusion, he made the decision his ego had been too afraid to make. He quit his accounting job. He enrolled in a carpentry apprenticeship. He started building things with his hands, just like his father had dreamed of doing. And the moment he made that choice, the synchronicities stopped. Not completely, they still occurred occasionally, but the storm lifted because the message had been received and honored. This is the crucial understanding. Synchronicities aren't just cosmic entertainment. They're not proof that you're special or that the universe loves you specifically. They're functional. They serve the process of individuation. They're the psyche's way of breaking through the ego's defenses when more subtle communications have failed. They're emergency broadcasts from the self, demanding that you pay attention to something you've been avoiding. But here's what fascinates me about synchronicity. It reveals something profound about the nature of reality itself. It suggests that consciousness and cosmos aren't separate. It suggests that your inner transformation actually has effects that ripple outward into the world. It suggests that individuation isn't just a private psychological process. It's a participation in the creative unfolding of reality itself. Jung went even further. He suggested that synchronicities are evidence of what he called the unus mundus, the unified world, the level of reality where psyche and matter are still one, undifferentiated. He believed that our usual experience of separation between subject and object, between inner and outer, between consciousness and world, this separation is an illusion created by ego consciousness. At a deeper level, everything is connected in a web of meaning, and synchronicities are moments when that deeper unity becomes visible. This is why synchronicity storms occur during soul evolution, because soul evolution is the process of descending from ego consciousness, which experiences separation, back into self-consciousness, which experiences unity. As you individuate, as you integrate more of the unconscious, as you become more whole, you naturally access this deeper level of reality, where meaningful connections exist beyond causality. Let me share something personal here. During my own descent into the unconscious, during my own confrontation with the shadow and the death of my old identity, I experienced synchronicity so intense that I questioned my sanity. I'd be writing about a particular Jungian concept, and someone would send me an email asking about that exact concept within minutes. I'd be contemplating a difficult decision, and I'd open a book at random to a passage that directly addressed my question. Numbers followed me, particularly 23, which I later discovered was the day Jung died. My dreams would preview conversations I'd have the next day with eerie accuracy. The temptation was to believe I was special, that I had some kind of supernatural gift, that reality was bending to my consciousness. And I did fall into that inflation for a while. I started thinking synchronicities proved I was on the right path, that I had cosmic approval for my choices. This is the danger Jung warned about, using synchronicities to inflate the ego rather than serve the self. What brought me back to earth was a simple realization. Everyone going through genuine transformation experiences synchronicities. They're not proof of specialness, they're proof of process. They're symptoms, just like the collapse of meaning, just like the shadow eruptions we'll discuss next. They're standard features of individuation, not supernatural gifts reserved for the chosen few. Once I accepted this, the synchronicities became tools rather than proofs. I stopped looking for cosmic validation and started listening for psychological communication. I stopped asking, "What does this mean about me?" and started asking, "What is my psyche trying to tell me?" That shift from inflation to function, from ego to self, that's when synchronicities became genuinely useful, rather than dangerously seductive. Here's what I want you to understand. If you're experiencing synchronicity storms right now, you're not losing your mind. Your mind is expanding beyond its usual boundaries. The edges between inner and outer are blurring because your consciousness is accessing a deeper level of reality where those edges were never as solid as you believed. This isn't pathology, it's perception. You're seeing something that was always there, but which your ordinary consciousness filtered out. But, and this is crucial, don't build your life around chasing synchronicities. Don't start making decisions based solely on signs. Don't use synchronicities as an excuse to avoid taking personal responsibility for your choices. They're communications, not commands. They're suggestions, not directives. They're your unconscious providing information, but you still have to do the conscious work of discernment, of weighing options, of making difficult choices. The Jungian understanding of synchronicity is paradoxical. They're both meaningful and dangerous. Meaningful because they reveal the deep interconnection between psyche and cosmos. Dangerous because they can inflate the ego into believing it's the center of cosmic attention. The key is to honor synchronicities without worshiping them, to receive their messages without becoming dependent on them, to let them support your process without replacing your agency. Jung himself experienced synchronicities throughout his life, but he never stopped being a rigorous scientist. He documented them, studied them, tried to understand their mechanism. He never let them replace rational thought or empirical observation. He held the tension between the numinous and the rational, between mystery and science, between magic and materialism. And that's the consciousness we need when navigating synchronicity storms. 1 foot in the ordinary world, 1 foot in the extraordinary, and the capacity to stand in the tension without collapsing into either side. David, the accountant who became a carpenter, told me something years after his transformation that perfectly captures this. He said, "The synchronicities didn't make the decision for me. They made the decision I'd already made in my unconscious finally possible to make consciously. They were the bridge between knowing what I needed to do and having the courage to actually do it." That's the function of synchronicity in soul evolution. It's not magic, it's medicine, it's not proof, it's permission. It's not the universe speaking to you as if you're special. It's your own unconscious speaking to you through the mirror of the world. Because sometimes that's the only language the conscious ego will finally listen to. If you're in a synchronicity storm right now, comment below with the most powerful synchronicity you've experienced recently, not to compare or compete, but to bear witness. Because when synchronicities are shared, when they're spoken aloud and witnessed by others, they fulfill their purpose. They bring unconscious content into consciousness. They make the invisible visible. They validate your experience of meaningful connection in a world that tells you everything is random. You're not imagining it. The storm is real. Your psyche is speaking. The question is, are you listening? Are you acting on what you're hearing? Or are you collecting synchronicities like spiritual trophies, enjoying the numinous feeling without honoring the transformation they're pointing toward? The second symptom of soul evolution is synchronicity storms. They're evidence that the boundary between your unconscious and the world is dissolving. That your transformation isn't just internal, it's rippling outward, affecting what you perceive, what you encounter, what appears in your path. Your psyche is reorganizing reality itself to get your attention, to guide you, to confirm what you already know in your depths, but haven't yet admitted to yourself. Listen, act, integrate. The universe isn't speaking to you because you're special. It's speaking to you because you're finally ready to hear. After synchronicities crack open your perception of reality, after you realize the universe is speaking in symbols and meaningful coincidences, your psyche delivers what might be the most terrifying symptom of all. Your shadow erupts. Everything you've repressed, denied, and projected onto others for decades suddenly comes flooding into consciousness with volcanic force. The rage you've been spiritually bypassing, the jealousy you've pretended not to feel, the cruelty you've convinced yourself you're incapable of. the sexual desires you've labeled as shameful, the power hunger you've disguised as service. All of it rises from the depths, demanding integration. This is the third symptom of soul evolution, shadow eruptions, and they're not gentle. They're not like slowly uncovering repressed material in therapy. They're explosive, overwhelming, often horrifying, because the shadow has been contained for so long, buried under such immense pressure, that when it finally breaks through, it comes with the force of everything you've used to keep it down. Let me tell you about Jennifer. Jennifer was a yoga teacher, 38 years old, beloved in her community for her gentle presence and compassionate teaching style. She'd built her entire identity around being a healer, a nurturer, someone who held space for others' pain. Her social media was full of inspirational quotes about love, forgiveness, and letting go. Her students saw her as almost saintly, someone who'd transcended the petty resentments and ego battles that plague most people. She'd been practicing yoga and meditation for 15 years, had studied with multiple teachers in India, and genuinely believed she'd done the deep work of spiritual evolution. Then something happened that shattered the carefully constructed spiritual persona she'd spent years building. Her partner of 7 years, a fellow yoga teacher, told her he was leaving, not for another person, but to honor his authentic path, which required releasing attachments and following his soul's calling to travel solo through Southeast Asia for an indefinite period. He delivered this news using all the spiritual language they'd both been fluent in, framing his abandonment as an act of consciousness, of growth, of honoring the truth. And something in Jennifer snapped. She felt it physically, a heat rising from her belly up through her chest, into her throat, behind her eyes. For 15 years she'd been breathing through anger, transforming it, releasing it, understanding it. But this was different. This wasn't anger she could breathe away. This was rage, pure, primal, murderous rage. And it brought with it a cascade of thoughts so violent, so vicious, that she didn't recognize herself. She fantasized about destroying his reputation, telling everyone in their yoga community about his secret porn addiction, about the times he'd lied, about his narcissistic manipulation disguised as spiritual wisdom. She imagined keying his car, emptying their shared bank account, sleeping with his best friend, and posting it on social media. The thoughts were so vivid, so detailed, so satisfying that they terrified her. But even more terrifying than the violent fantasies was the realization underneath them. She'd felt this way before, not just toward him, but toward dozens of people over the years. The student who'd challenged her teaching, the friend who'd gotten the opportunities Jennifer wanted, her mother, her sister, colleagues, competitors, anyone who'd threatened her, carefully maintained image of being good, evolved beyond such base emotions as jealousy and vengeance. She'd never acknowledged these feelings. She'd breathed through them, meditated on them, told herself they were just the ego or temporary clouds passing through consciousness. She'd used every spiritual technique at her disposal to avoid actually feeling the darkness that lived inside her. And now, with her life suddenly falling apart, with her identity as the good one suddenly unavailable, all of it was erupting at once. Jennifer called me 3 days after the breakup, in the middle of a full-blown shadow crisis. "I think I'm a terrible person," she said. "All these years I thought I was evolving, but I was just repressing. I'm full of hate, I'm vindictive, I'm cruel, I want to hurt people. I've always wanted to hurt people. What kind of healer am I? I'm a fraud." This is the moment Jung called the confrontation with the shadow, not an intellectual recognition that you have a dark side, but a visceral, undeniable encounter with your actual capacity for evil. Not metaphorical evil, not philosophical darkness, but your personal, specific ability to harm, to destroy, to be the villain in someone else's story. The shadow in Jungian psychology isn't some abstract concept. It's the collection of everything about yourself that you've rejected because it didn't fit your ego ideal, the person you want to be, the identity you've constructed, the image you present to the world, every quality your family disapproved of, every impulse society labeled as wrong, every aspect of yourself that threatened your belonging. You split it off, pushed it down, and threw it into the unconscious darkness, and there it has lived, growing, feeding on the energy you use to keep it repressed, waiting for the moment your defenses finally fail. Jung wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is." This is the crucial understanding. The shadow isn't evil because it contains evil impulses. It's dangerous because it's unconscious. When you refuse to acknowledge your capacity for cruelty, that cruelty doesn't disappear. It goes underground and operates through you in ways you don't recognize. You become cruel without knowing you're being cruel. You hurt people while convinced you're helping them. You manipulate while believing you're serving. The shadow is most destructive when you deny its existence. For Jennifer, the spiritual community she'd been part of had actually intensified her shadow rather than integrating it. The constant emphasis on being loving, compassionate, and forgiving had created an environment where negative emotions were seen as signs of insufficient spiritual development. So everyone in the community learned to perform peace, while their actual shadows raged beneath the surface. Affairs happened behind closed doors. Financial exploitation occurred under the guise of energy exchange. Power dynamics were brutal, but everyone spoke in soft tones and pretended to be evolved. This is what Jung saw again and again in spiritual movements. The shadow of the group becomes collective and therefore even more dangerous. Everyone agrees to repress the same things, to pretend they've transcended the same human impulses, and the collective shadow grows monstrous. Eventually, it erupts in scandals, abuses, cult dynamics, all the things that seem to contradict the stated values of the community, but which are actually the inevitable result of collective shadow repression. The shadow eruption Jennifer experienced is the psyche's emergency protocol. When the persona, the mask you show the world, becomes too rigid, too far from your actual psychological reality, the unconscious will eventually force a correction. It will sabotage the false identity. It will create a crisis that makes the persona impossible to maintain. It will erupt the shadow with such force that you can no longer pretend it doesn't exist. This is terrifying because it feels like becoming the thing you've spent your whole life trying not to be. For Jennifer, it felt like becoming her mother, critical, bitter, vengeful, everything she'd sworn she'd never become. But here's what Jung understood that transforms this terror into opportunity. You're not becoming these things. You're recognizing that you've always contained these capacities. The question isn't whether you're capable of cruelty. Every human is. The question is whether you'll make that capacity conscious and choose how to relate to it, or whether you'll keep it unconscious and let it run your life from the shadows. The shadow recognition framework I'm about to share is designed to help you distinguish between genuine shadow material and temporary emotional reactions, because not everything uncomfortable that arises is shadow. Sometimes you're just having a normal human response to a painful situation. But shadow has specific qualities that make it recognizable once you know what to look for. Quality 1. Disproportionate intensity. Shadow eruptions feel excessive relative to the trigger. Jennifer's rage at her partner was understandable given the abandonment, but the murderous quality of her fantasies, the glee she felt imagining his destruction, that intensity signaled shadow material, years of repressed anger finding an outlet. Quality 2. Moral revulsion. Shadow content makes you feel disgusted with yourself. Not just guilt over actions, but a deeper horror at your capacity for these thoughts and feelings. This revulsion is actually the ego's last defense. This can't be me because I'm better than this. But that's precisely the signal that you're encountering authentic shadow material. Quality 3. Projection patterns. Look at what you most judge in others. Look at what triggers you disproportionately when you encounter it in other people. Look at the qualities you're most vocal about hating. These are almost always projections of your own shadow. You can't see in others what you don't carry in yourself. As Jung said, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Quality 4. Repetitive relationships. If you keep encountering the same type of person, if the same conflicts keep arising in different relationships, if you're always dealing with the same character in different bodies, you're encountering your projected shadow. The narcissist you keep dating, the manipulator who keeps appearing in your life, the victim who always needs rescue. These are mirrors showing you your own unconscious material. Quality 5. Dream figures. Pay attention to the threatening figures in your dreams. The attacker, the criminal, the shadow person following you, the monster. These aren't random. They're personifications of shadow content trying to get your attention. The qualities these figures embody are qualities you've repressed and which are now trying to be integrated. Once you've recognized shadow material, the real work begins. Integration. Not suppression, not spiritual bypassing, not more repression, actual integration. This is where most people fail because integration requires something counterintuitive. You have to consciously embrace your capacity for evil without acting on it. Let me say that again because it's the most important sentence in this chapter. You must consciously embrace your capacity for evil without acting on it. This is Jung's dangerous wisdom that most spiritual teachers won't tell you. You cannot become whole by remaining good. You cannot individuate by transcending your darkness. You must descend into your darkness, acknowledge it, feel it, understand it, and ultimately integrate it back into your conscious personality, not as something you act on, but as something you own. The shadow integration protocol has 4 stages. Stage 1. Acknowledgement without identification. When shadow material erupts, your first instinct is to push it away or to identify with it completely. Both are traps. Instead, practice this. I am experiencing rage, jealousy, cruelty, and I am not only this rage, jealousy, cruelty. You acknowledge the feeling without becoming it. You witness it without dissociating from it. This is the razor's edge of consciousness. Stage 2. Active imagination dialogue. Jung's technique of active imagination is specifically designed for shadow integration. You personify the shadow content, give it a form, a voice, a presence, and then dialogue with it. Ask it what it wants, why it's here, what it's trying to protect or serve. This isn't role-playing, it's accessing the autonomous intelligence of the unconscious. The shadow has wisdom you need, but it can only share that wisdom once you stop running from it. Stage 3. Symbolic expression. Find non-harmful ways to express shadow energy. This is where art becomes crucial. Jennifer started painting violent, dark, visceral images that horrified her, but which needed to emerge. She wrote letters she never sent, filled with all the venom she wanted to spew. She screamed in her car. She broke dishes in her garage. These aren't indulgences. They're controlled outlets for energy that will be destructive if it has no channel. Stage 4. Conscious choice. This is the ultimate test of integration. Can you feel your capacity for cruelty and choose not to be cruel? Can you acknowledge your jealousy and choose not to sabotage? Can you own your rage and choose not to destroy? This isn't repression, it's mastery. Repression says, I don't feel this. Integration says, I feel this, I understand this, I own this, and I choose differently. Jennifer did this work. It took months. She sat with her rage until it revealed what was underneath. Grief. Massive, unprocessed grief. Not just about the relationship ending, but about all the times in her life she'd been abandoned, betrayed, unseen. The rage was protecting the grief because grief felt too vulnerable, too painful. Once she could feel the grief, the rage softened, not disappeared. The capacity remained, but it was no longer running her. She also had to acknowledge something even more uncomfortable. She'd used her partner. She'd kept him in a relationship he'd been ambivalent about for years because it served her identity as the good partner, the healer who could fix broken men. She'd manipulated him emotionally while believing she was being compassionate. Her shadow had been operating through her light all along. This is the most challenging recognition in shadow work, discovering that your shadow has been running your life even through your most spiritual or evolved behaviors. Your compassion masks your need for control. Your generosity masks your hunger for validation. Your wisdom sharing masks your superiority complex. Your humility masks your pride. The shadow doesn't just operate through obviously dark behaviors. It hijacks your light and expresses itself through inverted forms. Jung called this enantiodromia, the tendency of things to transform into their opposite. The more one-sidedly you identify with one pole, light, good, spiritual, evolved, the more powerfully your shadow accumulates on the opposite pole, dark, evil, base, primitive, and eventually the unconscious forces a correction. The spiritual teacher has a sexual scandal. The peace activist is revealed to be abusive at home. The compassionate healer turns out to be a narcissistic manipulator, not because they were consciously lying, but because they were unconsciously living out their shadow while convinced they'd transcended it. Let me share something personal about my own shadow eruption. I mentioned earlier how I used Jungian concepts to maintain intellectual distance from my emotions. What I didn't mention is what I discovered beneath that defense. I had a shadow of contempt, deep, corrosive contempt for people I judged as less conscious, less evolved, less psychologically sophisticated than I believed myself to be. I masked this contempt as education. I told myself I was helping people wake up, that my insights were serving others' growth. But beneath the helpful teacher was a cruel judge who felt secretly superior, who got satisfaction from being the smartest person in the room, who used psychological knowledge as a weapon to feel above the ordinary suffering of ordinary humans. This realization came through a brutal piece of feedback from someone I'd hurt with my insights. They said, "You don't teach Jung to help people. You teach Jung to prove you're better than them. You weaponize consciousness." And they were right. My shadow of contempt had been operating through my teaching all along, and I'd been completely blind to it because I'd convinced myself I was serving others. The integration of this shadow required me to own something horrifying. I have a capacity for cruelty that expresses itself through intelligence. I can use words to cut, concepts to dominate, insights to wound. I'm capable of psychological violence, and I've committed psychological violence while convinced I was being helpful. That capacity doesn't go away once it's recognized. It remains. But now it's conscious. Now I can feel when my contempt is rising, when my need to be superior is driving my speech, when my insights are serving my ego rather than the other person's growth, and I can choose differently. This is what shadow integration offers. Not purification, not transcendence, but conscious relationship with your darkness. You don't become good, you become whole. You don't eliminate your capacity for evil. You bring it under conscious governance. You don't transcend your shadow. You befriend it, understand it, and direct its energy toward creative rather than destructive ends. Jung's most radical insight about the shadow is this: it contains tremendous energy that you need. All the rage you've repressed, all the sexuality you've denied, all the power you've disowned, all the selfishness you've rejected. These aren't just negative qualities to be eliminated. They're vital life force that your overly rigid ego has labeled as unacceptable. When you integrate the shadow, you reclaim that energy. You become more alive, more passionate, more powerful, more authentic. Jennifer discovered this. Once she integrated her rage, she found a fierceness in her teaching that had been missing. She stopped being the soft, gentle, universally accommodating teacher and became someone who could say hard truths, who could challenge students, who could hold boundaries. She lost some students who preferred her old persona, but she attracted new ones who needed her authentic presence more than her spiritual performance. She also discovered something surprising. Her shadow held her strength. The cruelty she'd been terrified of was actually her capacity to cut through bullshit, to refuse manipulation, to say no without guilt. The vengefulness she'd been ashamed of was actually her capacity to stand up for herself, to demand respect, to stop playing victim. The jealousy she'd denied was actually her capacity to want things for herself, to have ambition, to stop making herself small, to make others comfortable. This is the paradox of shadow work. What you fear most about yourself is often your greatest gift in disguise. The shadow doesn't just contain the bad stuff. It contains everything the ego has rejected, including qualities that are actually positive but which didn't fit your family's or culture's expectations. Your strength, your sexuality, your intelligence, your ambition. If these threatened your belonging, you may have repressed them as much as you repressed your cruelty or rage. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." This is the sentence that should be tattooed on every spiritual seeker's body, because the spiritual path isn't about becoming more loving, more compassionate, more peaceful. It's about becoming more conscious, and consciousness includes consciousness of your capacity for hate, cruelty, and destruction. The irony is that you actually become more capable of genuine love once you've integrated your hate. You become more authentically compassionate once you've owned your cruelty. You become more genuinely peaceful once you've befriended your violence, because now these qualities are choices, not repressions. You choose love having felt your hate. You choose compassion having owned your cruelty. You choose peace having integrated your violence. This is what spiritual bypassing misses entirely. You can't transcend what you haven't first integrated. You can't rise above your shadow. You must descend into it, understand it, and bring it back up into consciousness transformed. The shadow must be redeemed, not rejected. It must be married to consciousness, not divorced from it. If you're experiencing shadow eruptions right now, if you're being flooded with rage, jealousy, cruelty, shame, perversion, violence, I want you to hear this clearly. This is not evidence that you're a bad person. This is evidence that you're becoming a whole person. The shadow isn't erupting because you're failing spiritually. It's erupting because your psyche is ready to integrate material that was previously too threatening for your ego to handle. The question isn't whether you have a shadow. Everyone does. The question is whether you'll make it conscious or keep it unconscious, whether you'll integrate it or project it, whether you'll own your darkness or spend your life running from it while it runs your life. Comment below what quality you've most judged in others. What behavior triggers you disproportionately? What characteristic makes you think, I could never be like that? That's probably your shadow. That's probably what your psyche is trying to integrate. And naming it, acknowledging it publicly, bringing it into the light of consciousness, that's the first step in the integration that will transform you. The third symptom of soul evolution is shadow eruptions. They're violent, terrifying and absolutely necessary, because you cannot become whole while remaining partial. You cannot individuate while rejecting half of your psyche. You cannot evolve your soul while pretending you don't have the capacity for evil. Your shadow is calling. It's time to descend. It's time to meet your darkness. Not to become it, but to integrate it. Not to act on it, but to understand it. Not to be destroyed by it, but to be made whole by it. This is the work Jung called the opus, the great work of transformation. And it begins with the courage to look into your own darkness and say, "This too is mine. This too is me, and I will no longer run." After your shadow has erupted and you're beginning the brutal work of integration, after you've encountered parts of yourself you didn't know existed or refused to acknowledge, your psyche begins a different kind of communication. Your dreams change, not gradually but dramatically. They become impossibly vivid, symbolically dense, emotionally overwhelming. You wake from them gasping, crying, or trembling, certain you've just experienced something more real than waking life. You remember them with crystalline clarity months or even years later, and they start repeating, not exact repetitions, but thematic cycles, the same symbols, appearing again and again in different contexts, the same figures showing up in different forms, as if your unconscious is running an intensive training program and you're the only student. This is the fourth symptom of soul evolution, dream intensification, and it's your psyche's night school, the place where your unconscious teaches lessons your conscious mind either can't comprehend or refuses to learn. Jung was adamant about this. Dreams are not random neural noise, not meaningless firings of sleeping neurons, not psychological garbage disposal. Dreams are the natural expression of the unconscious mind, speaking in its native language of symbols and images. And during periods of transformation, during soul evolution, dream activity doesn't just increase, it becomes pedagogical. Your dreams are literally teaching you how to integrate the unconscious material that's flooding into consciousness. Let me tell you about Aaron. Aaron was a 29-year-old doctoral student in literature, someone who lived almost entirely in his intellect. He could analyze texts with surgical precision, deconstruct arguments brilliantly, quote theory for hours, but he had no relationship with his body, no access to his emotions, and no tolerance for ambiguity or mystery. Everything had to be understood, categorized, explained. His advisor once told him, "You're so busy analyzing life that you've forgotten how to live it." Then Aaron started having a dream, the same dream night after night for 3 weeks. In the dream, he was in a massive library, floors upon floors of books extending in every direction, more books than could possibly exist. But every time he pulled a book from the shelf and opened it, the pages were blank, completely blank. Sometimes he'd pull down 100 books in the dream, increasingly frantic, and they'd all be empty. He'd wake up feeling suffocated, desperate, like he was drowning in emptiness disguised as knowledge. At first, Aaron did what he always did with confusing experiences. He tried to analyze it. He looked up dream dictionaries, which Jung would have hated. Symbols have personal meanings, not universal ones. He read about libraries as symbols of collective knowledge. He considered whether it was anxiety about his dissertation, but none of these interpretations touched the feeling the dream left him with, this visceral sense of being surrounded by false substance, of living in a world of empty containers masquerading as fullness. The dream changed after 3 weeks. Same library, but now there was a door he'd never noticed before. When he opened it, he found himself in a forest, wild, overgrown, dark. The contrast was shocking, from the sterile, organized, human-made library to chaotic, organic, non-human nature. And in the forest, he encountered a wolf. The wolf didn't attack. It just watched him with eyes that seemed impossibly intelligent, impossibly ancient. And Aaron woke up from this version of the dream feeling not terror, but longing. A longing so intense it brought tears to his eyes, though he couldn't have said what he was longing for. The dreams continued to evolve. Sometimes he'd be in the library and refuse to open any books, walking straight to the door. Sometimes the forest would be different, a desert, a mountain, an ocean, but the wolf was always there, always watching, always waiting for something Aaron couldn't figure out. And alongside these dreams, Aaron started having others, dreams where he was speaking languages he didn't know, dreams where he was drowning or being buried alive, dreams where he was making love with a woman whose face he could never see, but who felt more familiar than anyone he knew in waking life. After 2 months of dream intensification, Aaron finally did something he'd been resisting. He started a dream journal, not to analyze the dreams, but simply to record them, to give them space, attention, respect. And as he wrote them out in detail, patterns started to emerge that his analytical mind had missed, because analysis was precisely what the dreams were trying to move him beyond. The blank books represented his own life, full of information, knowledge, credentials, ideas, but empty of actual meaning, actual experience, actual life force. The library was his mind, vast but sterile, human-constructed but dead. The forest was everything he'd excluded from his intellectual existence: instinct, body, emotion, wildness, mystery. And the wolf was his own soul, his own vitality, waiting patiently for him to finally step out of the library and into life. This realization didn't come from interpretation. It came from living with the dreams long enough that their meaning revealed itself organically. Jung called this amplification. Sitting with a symbol, exploring its cultural and mythological resonances, examining your personal associations, and allowing the meaning to emerge rather than imposing an interpretation on it. Aaron eventually left his PhD program, not impulsively, but consciously, understanding that he'd been using scholarship as a way to avoid living, using analysis as a defense against feeling, using knowledge as a substitute for wisdom. The dreams had been showing him this for months, but he needed them to repeat, to intensify, to become undeniable before he could finally hear what they were saying. This is how dreams function during soul evolution. They're not just reflections of your psychological state, they're active agents of transformation. They're not passive images, but autonomous forces trying to move you in a particular direction, trying to compensate for the one-sidedness of your conscious attitude, trying to balance your psyche by introducing material from the unconscious. Jung distinguished between 2 types of dreams: little dreams and big dreams. Little dreams are the nightly processing of daily experiences, your brain sorting through the day's events, consolidating memories, working through minor anxieties. These are personal, forgettable, often fragmented. Big dreams, however, are numinous events. They come from the deep unconscious, the archetypal realm, and they carry a weight, a significance, a staying power that little dreams never have. Big dreams are the ones that wake you up at 3 a.m., feeling like you've just returned from another dimension. They're the ones you remember 30 years later with the same clarity as the night you had them. They're the ones that shift something fundamental in your relationship to reality. And during soul evolution, big dreams become more frequent. Your psyche is reaching into the collective unconscious and bringing archetypal material into your personal experience, preparing you for the transformation ahead. The dream mapping technique I'm about to share is designed to help you track these big dreams and decode their evolutionary message. This isn't about dream interpretation in the pop psychology sense. It's about learning to read the symbolic language your unconscious speaks when verbal language fails. Step 1. record without interpretation. When you wake from a significant dream, write it down immediately in present tense, as if it's happening now. Don't analyze, don't interpret, just capture the dream in as much sensory detail as possible. What did you see, hear, feel, smell? What was the emotional tone? What were the colors, the light quality, the atmosphere? Step 2. Identify recurring symbols. After you've recorded dreams for several weeks, look for patterns. What images keep appearing? What figures keep showing up? What locations, actions, or emotions repeat across multiple dreams? These recurring elements are your psyche's primary vocabulary, the symbols it's using to communicate specific lessons or insights. Step 3. Amplification through association. Take each recurring symbol and explore it without rushing to conclusion. What are your personal associations with this symbol? What cultural or mythological meanings does it carry? What feelings arise when you sit with it? Let the symbol reveal its layers rather than imposing a single meaning on it. Step 4. Track the narrative arc. Dreams during soul evolution often tell a story across weeks or months. Aaron's dreams had a clear progression, from the blank library to discovering the door to encountering the wolf to finally entering the wilderness. Track how your dream symbols evolve over time. This shows you the direction your psyche is moving. Step 5. Active imagination. Jung's powerful technique for working with dream material. After recording a dream, go back into it imaginatively while awake. Re-enter the dream landscape, but now with conscious awareness. Dialogue with the dream figures. Ask them questions. Let them respond. This isn't fantasy. It's a technique for accessing the autonomous intelligence of the unconscious. Let me share a big dream I had during my own soul evolution, because sometimes the most effective teaching is showing rather than telling. I dreamed I was in my childhood home, but it was decaying, walls crumbling, floor rotting, ceiling collapsing. I was trying desperately to hold it together, literally using my body to support the walls, but everything was falling apart despite my efforts. Then my dead grandfather appeared, not as I remembered him, but younger, stronger. He looked at me with such compassion and said, "You can't hold up a house that's already condemned, but you can salvage the foundation and build something new." I woke from that dream and immediately understood what years of therapy hadn't touched. I was still trying to maintain psychological structures from childhood, ways of being, coping mechanisms, relationship patterns that were fundamentally unsound. No amount of effort could repair them because they'd been built on a faulty foundation to begin with. My psyche was telling me I needed to let the old structure collapse completely so I could build something authentic on what remained. The grandfather in the dream wasn't just a memory of my actual grandfather. He was an archetypal figure, what Jung called the wise old man, an aspect of my own psyche that held knowledge my ego didn't have access to. This is crucial to understand about dream figures. They're not just representations of people you know. They're autonomous aspects of your unconscious personified intelligences with their own perspectives and wisdom. Jung spent decades working with dream figures through active imagination. His most famous dialogues were with Philemon, a wise old man who appeared first in dreams and then in waking visions. Philemon taught Jung things Jung's conscious mind didn't know, not through channeling or spiritualism, but through accessing the deep wisdom of the collective unconscious that Jung carried within his own psyche. Philemon was Jung's inner teacher, an autonomous manifestation of the self guiding the ego through transformation. You have these figures in your dreams too. The wise woman who appears with cryptic advice, the trickster who disrupts your plans, the shadow figure who chases you, the divine child who represents innocence or new beginnings. These aren't random. They're archetypes, universal patterns of human experience that your personal unconscious is clothing in specific images relevant to your journey. Here's the crucial understanding about dream intensification during soul evolution. Your dreams become more frequent and vivid because your unconscious is flooding consciousness with material you need to integrate. The barrier between conscious and unconscious is thinning. Your psyche is preparing you for the death and rebirth that individuation requires, and it's using the dream space, where your ego defenses are lowered, to introduce material that you'd resist or dismiss in waking life. This is why you can't just analyze dreams intellectually and call it integration. Aaron could have spent years analyzing his library dreams symbolically and never changed anything. The integration happened when he honored what the dream was pointing to, not by understanding it, but by acting on it, by actually leaving the library of his academic life and entering the wilderness of direct experience. Jung wrote, "The dream is a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul." But here's what people miss. Finding that door isn't enough. You have to walk through it. You have to be willing to enter the secret recesses your dreams are revealing. You have to let your dreams change not just how you think, but how you live. The intensification of dreams during soul evolution often has a specific quality that distinguishes them from ordinary dreaming. There's a sense of being shown something, being taught something, being initiated into something. The dreams feel intentional, pedagogical, like you're enrolled in a curriculum you didn't consciously sign up for, but which your soul recognizes as essential. Sometimes the lessons are symbolic. Sometimes they're literal previews of future events. What Jung called prospective dreams, where the unconscious shows you what's coming so you can prepare. Sometimes they're compensatory, balancing out your one-sided conscious attitude by showing you what you're missing or denying. And sometimes they're simply numinous, contact with the sacred, with the divine, with the archetypal realm that exists beneath personal consciousness. I want to address something important. Not everyone remembers their dreams. Some people insist they don't dream at all, though science shows everyone dreams multiple times per night. If you're in soul evolution but not remembering dreams, it doesn't mean the process isn't working. It means your psyche is communicating through other channels. Some people receive their unconscious communications through synchronicities, some through physical symptoms, some through intense emotions or creative compulsions. But if you want to access your dreams more fully, here's what Jung recommended. Set the intention before sleep. Tell your unconscious you're listening, you're paying attention, you want to remember. Keep a journal by your bed. Don't move when you first wake. Lie still and let the dream images surface before your conscious mind fully engages. And most importantly, treat dreams with respect. Don't dismiss them as just dreams. Honor them as communications from the deepest parts of yourself. The dream intensification symptom often correlates with specific phases of transformation. When you're in nigredo, the death phase, the darkness, your dreams become darker too. Themes of death, decay, drowning, being buried alive, apocalyptic scenarios. These aren't nightmares in the pathological sense. They're symbolic representations of the ego death you're undergoing. Your psyche is processing the dissolution of the old self, and dreams are the container where that dangerous work can happen without destroying your waking functionality. As you move into albedo, the purification phase, dreams often become clearer, brighter, involve water, cleaning, whiteness, light beginning to appear after darkness. The chaos starts to organize, patterns emerge, and in the later stages, citrinitas and rubedo, dreams can become transcendent, mystical, featuring gold, sacred marriages, unions of opposites, visions of wholeness. Aaron's dreams followed this progression exactly. After months of the dark forest and the watching wolf, his dreams shifted. He started dreaming of water, swimming in clear pools, standing under waterfalls, floating in oceans. And eventually, he had a dream where the wolf transformed into a woman, and they danced together in a clearing as the sun rose. The symbol had evolved through the alchemical stages, from the death of the false self, blank books, library, through the descent into instinct and nature, dark forest, wolf, through purification, water dreams, to integration and union, dancing with the transformed wolf woman. He didn't analyze this progression intellectually, he lived it. The dreams were showing him his own transformation before his conscious mind understood what was happening. By the time he had the dancing dream, he'd already made the external changes, left academia, started working with his hands as a carpenter. Like David from the Synchronicity chapter, these archetypes repeat across different lives. Begun dating someone he actually felt passion for, rather than someone who looked good on paper. The dreams weren't predicting his future, they were showing him his psychological future, the internal transformation that would then manifest externally. This is Jung's insight. Dreams are perspective because they show you who you're becoming, and if you cooperate with that becoming, the external life gradually aligns with the internal reality the dreams have been revealing. Let me give you a practical warning about dream intensification. It can be destabilizing if you're not grounded in waking life. If you're spending all your energy in the dream world, if you're more alive in your dreams than in your daily existence, if you're confusing dream reality with waking reality, you need to strengthen your ego structure, not just dissolve into the unconscious. Jung was clear about this. You need a strong ego to contain unconscious material. A weak ego gets flooded and overwhelmed. Dream intensification should enrich your waking life, not replace it. The dreams are meant to transform how you live, not become an escape from living. This is where active imagination becomes crucial. Not just passive dream reception, but active engagement. After you record a dream, you go back into it consciously. You re-enter the dream landscape with awareness and agency. You dialogue with the figures, ask questions, negotiate, learn. This technique bridges unconscious and conscious, allowing integration to happen in real time rather than through passive interpretation. Here's how to practice active imagination with dream material. Find a quiet space where you won't be disturbed. Close your eyes and recall the dream in vivid detail. See the landscape, feel the atmosphere. But now, instead of just watching the dream replay, step into it as a conscious participant. If there's a figure in the dream, the wolf, the wise woman, the shadow person, approach them. Speak to them. Ask, "Who are you? What do you want from me? What are you trying to teach me?" And here's the crucial part. Listen. Let them answer. Don't make up the answer with your conscious mind. Wait for a response to emerge spontaneously from your imagination. It might come as words, images, feelings, or knowing. Trust what arises. This is the autonomous unconscious speaking. You can write out these dialogues, speak them aloud, or simply hold them internally. The key is treating the dream figures as real autonomous beings with their own intelligence, not as symbols to be decoded. They are symbols, but they're living symbols, psychic entities that carry wisdom your ego doesn't possess. Aaron eventually did this with the wolf. In an active imagination session, he asked the wolf, "Why have you been watching me?" And the wolf replied in that strange way, where you're both creating and receiving the response. "I'm not watching you. I'm waiting for you. I've been here your entire life. You're the one who's been hiding in the library." This simple exchange shifted something in Aaron more profoundly than months of dream analysis had, because he wasn't just understanding the symbol intellectually, he was encountering the actual psychic force the symbol represented. The wolf was his instinctual nature, his wild vitality, his connection to the body and nature and direct experience. and it had been waiting patiently while his ego built its elaborate intellectual defenses. Now I want to address the difference between big dreams and archetypal dreams. Big dreams have personal significance. They address your specific situation, your psychological complexes, your particular journey. Archetypal dreams go beyond the personal. They connect you to universal human experiences, ancient patterns, collective themes that transcend your individual life. You know you've had an archetypal dream when it feels ancient, when the symbols seem older than you, when the dream has a mythological or religious quality. Dreams of descending into the underworld. Dreams of sacred marriages, dreams of dismemberment and reassembly. Dreams of meeting gods or demons or cosmic forces. These aren't just about your personal psychology, they're initiatory dreams, connecting you to patterns humans have been experiencing for millennia. Jung studied mythology, religion, alchemy, and fairy tales, specifically to understand the archetypal patterns that appear in dreams. He discovered that people who'd never studied these traditions would dream images that appeared in ancient Gnostic texts, medieval alchemy, or indigenous shamanic practices. This proved to Jung that the collective unconscious was real, that beneath our personal unconscious lies a layer of psyche shared by all humanity, containing universal patterns of experience. During soul evolution, archetypal dreams become more common because you're not just transforming your personal ego, you're connecting to something transpersonal, something larger than your individual life. You're participating in a pattern of death and rebirth that humans have been enacting since consciousness first emerged. Let me share an archetypal dream that marked a turning point in my own process. I dreamed I was in an ancient temple, underground, with no way in or out that I could see. In the center was an altar, and on the altar was a golden egg. I knew, with that strange dream knowing that bypasses logic, that I had to break the egg. But I was terrified because I also knew that whatever was inside would change everything. I stood there paralyzed for what felt like hours in dream time. Finally, I picked up the egg. It was impossibly heavy, as if it contained the weight of worlds, and smashed it against the altar. It shattered, and what emerged wasn't a creature. It was light, pure, blinding, overwhelming light that filled the entire temple, filled my body, filled everything. And I woke up with tears streaming down my face, feeling like I'd just been initiated into something I didn't have words for. That dream wasn't about my personal life. It was about the alchemical process of breaking the prima materia, the golden egg, to release the philosophical gold, the light. It was about destroying the container to release the essence. It was about the death that must precede transformation. I hadn't been studying alchemy consciously at that time. This was before I dove deeply into Jung's alchemical writings, but my unconscious was showing me the pattern I was living through. This is what archetypal dreams do. They show you that your personal suffering, your individual transformation, your specific crisis, it's all part of an ancient pattern. You're not alone. You're not the first. This journey has been walked by countless souls before you, and the unconscious is connecting you to that lineage. The dream interpretation mistake most people make is trying to find a single, fixed meaning for each symbol. A snake means sexuality. Water means the unconscious. A house means the self. This is how dream dictionaries work, and Jung despised this approach, because symbols are alive. They mean different things to different people in different contexts. For one person, a snake might represent sexual energy. For another, it might represent healing, the medical caduceus. For another, it might represent betrayal, being bitten by someone you trusted. For another, it might represent transformation, shedding skin. The meaning isn't in some universal symbolic lexicon. It's in the relationship between the dreamer and the symbol. This is why Jung's method of amplification is so powerful. You take a symbol from your dream and you explore it from multiple angles. What's your personal association with this symbol? What cultural meanings does it carry? What mythological appearances does it have? What emotional response does it trigger in you? What does it remind you of? What other dreams has it appeared in? Through this exploration, the symbol's specific meaning for you in your current situation begins to reveal itself, not through interpretation imposed from outside, but through amplification emerging from within. Aaron did this with the library symbol. At first, he thought it just meant knowledge or academia, but as he amplified it, he realized libraries are where knowledge is stored, but not lived. Books are other people's experiences, not your own. The order and organization of a library is human-imposed, artificial. Libraries are silent, no authentic voice, no living dialogue. The symbol revealed itself to be about his entire way of being in the world, experiencing life secondhand, organizing reality intellectually, living in silence rather than authentic expression. The blank pages then made perfect sense. His life felt empty because it was empty. It was full of other people's knowledge, other people's experiences, other people's meanings. He hadn't yet written his own story. The pages were blank because he hadn't yet lived anything that was genuinely his. This is the kind of understanding that can only come through deep engagement with dreams, not quick interpretation. It requires patience, curiosity, and willingness to let the dream speak rather than making it say what you want to hear. I want to address nightmares specifically, because during soul evolution, nightmares can intensify dramatically. Being chased, being attacked, watching loved ones die, apocalyptic scenarios, body horror. These are common when the psyche is processing deep transformation. Jung's approach to nightmares was revolutionary. Don't flee from them. Turn and face them. The figure chasing you in the dream, stop running and confront it. Ask it who it is, what it wants. Almost always, the nightmare figure is your own shadow or a repressed aspect of yourself trying to get your attention. When you finally turn and face it, when you dialogue with it instead of fleeing, it often transforms into something helpful or reveals crucial information. This technique requires practice and courage. You have to train yourself, even in dreams, to stop the instinctive fear response and choose consciousness instead. Some people use lucid dreaming practices. For this, becoming aware they're dreaming, and then consciously choosing to confront rather than flee. But even if you're not lucid, setting the intention before sleep, if I'm chased tonight, I will turn and face what's chasing me, can influence dream behavior. The nightmares during soul evolution aren't random terror. They're the psyche's way of forcing confrontation with what you've been avoiding. The more you flee in dreams, the more intense the nightmares become. The moment you stop and face them, something shifts. The energy that was pursuing you becomes available to you. Now, let's talk about recurring dreams. Dreams that repeat over months or years, sometimes with slight variations, but essentially the same dream. Jung saw these as the psyche persistently trying to communicate something the conscious mind is refusing to hear. The dream repeats because the message hasn't been received. The lesson hasn't been learned. The integration hasn't happened. Aaron's library dream is a perfect example. It repeated nightly until he started paying attention, started journaling, started honoring what it was showing him. Once he began making changes in his actual life, once he started moving from intellectual knowledge to embodied experience, the dream evolved. It didn't need to repeat because the message was finally being heard and acted upon. If you have a recurring dream, this is your psyche's emergency broadcast system. It's saying, this is crucial. You need to pay attention to this. I will keep showing you until you understand. The dream might be uncomfortable, frustrating, or terrifying, but it's persistent because it's important. Your job with recurring dreams is to, first, record every version meticulously. Look for what changes and what stays the same. The consistent elements are the core message. The variations show how your relationship to the message is evolving. Second, take the dream seriously. Don't dismiss it as just a recurring dream. Treat it as a letter from your unconscious that you've been refusing to open. Third, use active imagination to engage directly with the dream scenario. Enter it consciously and ask, what are you trying to tell me? What do I need to understand? What must I change? Fourth, look for connections to your waking life. Where are you stuck? What decision are you avoiding? What pattern keeps repeating? Recurring dreams often mirror recurring life patterns. Fifth, take action. Dreams don't just want to be understood, they want to transform your life. If a recurring dream is showing you something, the repetition will stop when you honor the message through concrete change. The dream intensification symptom reaches its peak during what Jung called the transcendent function, the moment when conscious and unconscious begin to communicate directly, creating something new that transcends both. This is when dreams stop being just reflections of your psyche and become creative acts of transformation. The dreams are literally creating new psychological structures, new ways of being, new capacities that didn't exist before. You'll know you're in this phase when dreams start giving you solutions rather than just problems. When dream figures start teaching you techniques, showing you paths forward, offering wisdom that your conscious mind didn't possess. When you wake from dreams feeling not just emotionally moved, but actually changed, like something has been rewired in your psyche overnight. This is the night school of the soul in full operation. Your unconscious becomes your teacher, your guide, your therapist, your initiator. And if you cooperate, if you honor the dreams, record them, amplify them, engage with them through active imagination, and most importantly, let them change how you live, they will guide you through the entire individuation process. Jung believed dreams were nature's provision for psychological transformation. Just as the body heals itself if given the right conditions, the psyche will transform itself if you provide conscious cooperation. Dreams are the primary mechanism of this natural healing process. They diagnose what's wrong, prescribe what's needed, and guide the cure, all in symbolic language that bypasses the ego's defenses and resistance. The fourth symptom of soul evolution, dream intensification, is your psyche's invitation to night school. The curriculum is custom designed for you. The teacher is your own unconscious. The classroom is the imaginal realm between sleeping and waking. And the graduation ceremony is waking up not just from sleep, but from unconscious living itself. If your dreams are intensifying right now, if you're waking night after night with powerful images you can't shake, if your sleep has become more eventful than your waking life, you're not losing your mind. You're finding your soul. You're not being haunted. You're being taught. You're not experiencing sleep disturbance. You're experiencing soul emergence. Start the journal tonight. Record everything. Analyze nothing at first. Just witness. Just document. Just honor. The meanings will reveal themselves when you're ready. The lessons will become clear when you've earned them through attention and respect. Your dreams are speaking. The question is, are you listening? Are you writing them down? Are you taking them seriously? Are you letting them change not just how you sleep, but how you live? The night school of the soul is in session, and you've been enrolled whether you consciously signed up or not. Your unconscious is teaching. Your dreams are the textbook. Your life is the exam. Class is in session. Pay attention, take notes, do the homework, and watch as your dreams transform your reality from the inside out. After your dreams have intensified, after you've spent months in the night school, of the soul learning lessons you didn't know you needed. Something devastating happens in your waking life. Your relationships begin to collapse. Not all of them, not randomly, but specifically the relationships that were built on projections, unconscious agreements, and mutual shadow avoidance. The people you were closest to suddenly feel like strangers. The partner you thought you knew reveals themselves to be someone entirely different. Or worse, you reveal yourself to be someone entirely different, and the relationship can't survive your transformation. This is the fifth symptom of soul evolution, relationship upheaval. And it's one of the most painful symptoms, because relationships are where we invest our deepest needs for belonging, for love, for connection. When those relationships shatter during transformation, it feels like losing your foundation. But here's what Jung understood. Those relationships aren't actually breaking. The projections are breaking. The fantasies are breaking. The unconscious contracts are breaking. And what remains afterward is the possibility of genuine connection, but only if both people can tolerate the truth of who they actually are rather than who they needed each other to be. Let me tell you about Michelle and Robert. They'd been married for 20 years. High school sweethearts who'd built an entire life together. 2 kids, successful careers, a beautiful home, mutual respect. From the outside, they were the model couple. Everyone envied their relationship. They seemed to have what marriage is supposed to be: partnership, stability, shared values, enduring love. But something was shifting in Michelle. She'd entered what Jung would call a midlife individuation crisis, that period when the psyche demands you finally become who you actually are rather than who you've been performing as for decades. She started questioning everything. Her career as a corporate lawyer that had once felt meaningful now felt suffocating. The suburban life that had once felt secure now felt like a prison. Even her own personality, the efficient, organized, pragmatic Michelle everyone knew, started to feel like a costume she couldn't take off. And as Michelle began to change, as she started therapy and shadow work and dream analysis, as she started to reclaim parts of herself she'd repressed to maintain her marriage, something terrifying happened. She looked at Robert one morning across the breakfast table, and she didn't recognize him. Not because he'd changed, but because she was seeing him clearly for the first time in 20 years, without her projections clouding her vision, without her needs shaping her perception, without the unconscious agreement they'd made to play specific roles for each other. He was a stranger. This moment, this sudden, horrifying clarity, this is what Jung meant by the withdrawal of projections. And it's one of the most disorienting experiences in the individuation process. Here's what projection is. You take an unconscious part of yourself, usually an aspect of your anima or animus, your inner contrasexual archetype, and you cast it onto another person. Then you fall in love with or become fascinated by your own projection. You're not actually seeing the other person. You're seeing your own unconscious material clothed in their body. And because you need that projection to remain unconscious, you unconsciously choose people who can carry it convincingly. Michelle had projected her animus, her inner masculine, her capacity for strength, decisiveness, protection, onto Robert. She'd chosen him in part because he could carry that projection. He was confident, decisive, protective, everything her feminine ego felt it lacked. And Robert had projected his anima, his inner feminine, his capacity for empathy, emotional depth, nurturing, onto Michelle. She was warm, emotionally articulate, caring, everything his masculine ego felt it lacked. For 20 years, they'd been in relationship not with each other, but with their own projections. They'd loved their own unconscious material reflected back to them. And it worked. As long as neither of them individuated, as long as they both remained unconscious, as long as the projections stayed intact. But individuation destroys projections, because individuation requires you to integrate your anima or animus to develop the qualities you've been projecting onto others. As Michelle integrated her inner masculine, as she developed her own strength, her own decisiveness, her own capacity to protect herself, she no longer needed Robert to carry that for her. The projection withdrawn, she could finally see him as he actually was. Not her masculine hero, but a deeply insecure man who used control and rigid thinking to manage his anxiety. Not her protector, but someone who needed to be needed in order to feel valuable. And from Robert's perspective, as Michelle changed, he lost his projection screen. She was no longer the warm, emotionally available, endlessly nurturing presence he'd married. She was becoming assertive, boundaried, focused on her own needs rather than his. His anima projection had nowhere to land anymore. And without that projection, he didn't know who this woman was or how to relate to her. This is the crisis that relationship upheaval creates. When you withdraw your projections, you have to choose whether to stay in relationship with the actual person or whether the relationship was only sustainable through mutual projection. Jung was brutally honest about this. Many relationships cannot survive individuation. They were never actually intimate. They were projection systems, unconscious contracts where two people agreed to play specific roles for each other. You'll be my strong masculine protector, and I'll be your nurturing feminine caretaker. You'll be my creative spiritual guide, and I'll be your grounding, practical anchor. You'll be my emotional, and I'll be your rational. These contracts feel like love, but they're actually complementarity, each person providing what the other lacks, maintaining psychological equilibrium but preventing genuine growth. The projection withdrawal process has specific stages that happen during relationship upheaval. Stage 1. Idealization cracks. The first sign is subtle. Small moments where the person doesn't fit your fantasy of them. Your spiritual partner says something surprisingly shallow. Your strong husband shows unexpected weakness. Your nurturing wife displays unexpected selfishness. At first, you dismiss these moments, but they accumulate. Stage 2. Disillusionment. The cracks widen. You start seeing patterns you'd been blind to. The quality you found most attractive reveals its shadow side. His confidence was actually arrogance. Her spontaneity was actually irresponsibility. Their passion was actually volatility. You feel betrayed, but really you're just seeing clearly for the first time. Stage 3. Projection collapse. Suddenly, dramatically, the entire projection shatters. You look at this person you thought you knew intimately, and they're a stranger. Or worse, they're exactly who they've always been, but you're seeing them without the filter of your needs and fantasies. This stage is devastating because it feels like they changed, but they didn't. Your perception did. Stage 4. The mirror effect. This is the most psychologically sophisticated stage and the most painful. You realize that everything you're seeing in them that disturbs you, disappoints you, or repels you, it's also in you. The qualities you're judging in them are your own shadow material. The ways they're failing you are the ways you've been failing yourself. They're not your problem, they're your mirror. Stage 5. Choose conscious relationship or conscious ending. After projection collapse, you face a choice. Can this relationship be renegotiated at a higher level of consciousness? Can you love the actual person rather than your fantasy of them? Can they love the actual you rather than their fantasy of you? Or was the relationship only possible through projection, and now that consciousness has arrived, it must end? Michelle and Robert went through all 5 stages. The marriage didn't survive. Not because either of them was bad or wrong, not because they stopped caring, but because the relationship had been built on unconscious foundations, and conscious foundations require different architecture. They tried therapy, separation and reunion, open communication, conscious relating practices, but ultimately they discovered they'd never actually chosen each other. They'd chosen their projections of each other, and once those projections dissolved, there wasn't enough authentic connection underneath to build on. The divorce was heartbreaking but clean. There was grief but no bitterness, because they both understood through their individual work what had happened. They hadn't failed. They'd succeeded in becoming conscious, and consciousness revealed that their marriage contract was unconscious. They parted with genuine respect, co-parenting their children, honoring what the relationship had been while accepting it couldn't continue. This is the relationship upheaval at its most mature, when both people can recognize what's happening and honor it rather than fight it. But that's rare. More often, one person individuates while the other resists, and the relationship becomes a battleground. I've watched this pattern countless times. One partner begins therapy, shadow work, consciousness exploration. They start changing, becoming more authentic, more boundaried, less willing to play their old role. The other partner, still unconscious, experiences this as betrayal. You're not the person I married, and they're right. But the person they married was a persona, a performance, not the actual human underneath. The unconscious partner often escalates, trying to pull the individuating partner back into the old dynamic through guilt, anger, ultimatums, or by becoming the victim. You're being selfish. You're destroying our family. You're abandoning your responsibilities. What they're really saying is, you're breaking our unconscious contract. You're not being who I need you to be anymore. And I'm terrified because if you change, I'll have to change, and I'm not ready. Jung saw this dynamic in his own marriage. Emma Jung, his wife, eventually did her own individuation work and became a Jungian analyst herself. But for years, she struggled with Carl's transformation, his affair with Tony Wolfe, his descent into the unconscious during his Red Book period. The marriage survived, but only because Emma eventually chose her own individuation rather than remaining in unconscious resentment. She integrated her animus, developed her own authority, and stopped trying to be the stabilizing force for Carl's chaos. The relationship was renegotiated at a higher level of consciousness, but it required both of them to individuate. Not all relationships require ending. Some can be renegotiated, but renegotiation requires both people to be willing to, first, withdraw their projections and see each other clearly. This means accepting that the person is not your completion, not your salvation, not your solution. They're a separate individual with their own path. Second, develop the qualities you've been projecting. If you've needed them to be strong, you must develop your own strength. If you've needed them to be emotional, you must develop your own emotional depth. Third, relate consciously rather than unconsciously. This means communicating explicitly about needs, boundaries, and desires, rather than expecting the other person to intuit or fulfill unconscious contracts. Fourth, accept that the relationship will be different. You can't have unconscious intimacy and conscious intimacy simultaneously. The old comfort, the old familiarity, the old ease, that was based on mutual unconsciousness. Conscious relating is more authentic but often less comfortable. Fifth, do your own. Work without making them your project. You can't individuate for someone else. You can't force consciousness on someone who's not ready. You can only work on yourself and decide whether you can remain in relationship with them as they are, not as you hope they'll become. The conscious relationship test Jung would apply is simple but brutal. Can you love this person without needing them to be different than they are? Can you accept them fully while still maintaining your boundaries? Can you be yourself fully without requiring their approval? If the answer to any of these questions is no, the relationship is still based on projection or codependence, not genuine connection. Now, let me talk about the relationship pattern that often emerges during soul evolution, the syzygy crisis. Jung used this term, borrowed from astronomy, where it means the alignment of celestial bodies, to describe the internal relationship between masculine and feminine principles within the psyche. Every person, regardless of biological sex, contains both masculine and feminine psychological principles. Jung called the feminine principle in a man the anima, and the masculine principle in a woman the animus. These aren't gender stereotypes. They're archetypal patterns of consciousness that every psyche contains. The anima is the principle of relationship, eros, connection, emotional depth, receptivity, the capacity to relate to the unconscious. The animus is the principle of logos, focused consciousness, discrimination, assertion, the capacity to act in the world with purpose. A psychologically whole person has integrated both, can access both, moves fluidly between both. But most people haven't integrated their contrasexual archetype. Instead, they project it onto partners. A man projects his anima onto women, falling in love with his own unconscious feminine reflected back to him. A woman projects her animus onto men, falling in love with her own unconscious masculine reflected back to her. During soul evolution, you're forced to integrate your anima or animus to develop the qualities you've been projecting. And this integration often triggers a syzygy crisis in relationships. Your partner loses their role as the carrier of your contrasexual archetype, and the relationship must either evolve or end. Michelle's integration of her animus meant she no longer needed Robert to be her decisive, protective, strong masculine presence. She was developing those qualities herself. Robert's inability to integrate his anima meant he still needed Michelle to be his emotional, nurturing, connecting feminine presence, which she was no longer willing to be. The asymmetry became intolerable. This is why soul evolution so often coincides with divorce, affairs, or dramatic relationship changes, not because individuation makes you selfish or irresponsible, but because it makes projection impossible. And many relationships are built entirely on projection. The mirror effect is perhaps the most powerful teaching relationship upheaval offers. Every quality in your partner that disturbs you, Jung would ask you to own it in yourself. Every way they're failing to meet your needs, he'd ask you to recognize how you're failing to meet your own needs. Every judgment you have of them, he'd ask you to turn that judgment back on yourself and see where it's true. This doesn't mean your partner isn't actually difficult or problematic, but it means that your intense emotional reaction to their difficulties is probably about you, not them. If their behavior didn't touch something in your own psyche, you'd observe it with relative neutrality. The fact that it triggers you means it's connected to your shadow, your projections, your wounds. Michelle realized through therapy that her rage at Robert for being controlling was connected to her rage at herself for having given away her power for 20 years. Robert wasn't controlling her. She'd been allowing herself to be controlled because she didn't want the responsibility of her own life. He was just playing the role she'd unconsciously assigned him. When she owned that, when she took back her power and stopped blaming him for her choices, the rage dissolved into grief. Grief for the years she'd lost. Grief for the woman she could have been if she'd individuated earlier. This is the mirror effect. The people in your life, especially your intimate partners, are reflecting back your unconscious material. They show you what you haven't integrated, what you're still projecting, what you're still avoiding in yourself. And during soul evolution, as consciousness expands, these mirrors become impossible to ignore. The most painful version of relationship upheaval is when you realize the person you loved most was actually the person you used most to avoid your own growth, to maintain your persona, to stay unconscious. You married them not because they were your perfect match, but because they allowed you to remain who you were. They enabled your stagnation, your avoidance, your fear of transformation, and you did the same for them. This mutual enabling masquerades as love, as loyalty, as commitment, but it's actually mutual imprisonment. Both people unconsciously agree. I won't challenge your unconsciousness if you don't challenge mine. I'll support your persona if you support mine. I'll let you stay stuck if you let me stay stuck. Soul evolution breaks these agreements, and when it does, the partner who's still invested in stagnation will often become hostile, manipulative, or desperate. They'll weaponize your history together. They'll invoke your shared identity. They'll use the children, the finances, the social network, anything to pull you back into the old unconscious contract. Jung's advice in these situations was clear but difficult. You cannot sacrifice your individuation for anyone, not even your partner, not even your children. Because an unconscious parent, an unconscious partner, an unconscious person, they have nothing of real value to offer anyone. Only a conscious person can truly love, truly parent, truly serve. So the most loving thing you can do, even when it looks selfish from the outside, is to continue your own transformation and trust that the relationships that are meant to survive will evolve with you. Let me share something personal here. I lost my closest friendship during my own soul evolution. This was someone I'd known for 15 years, someone I considered family. But as I changed, as I integrated my shadow and withdrew my projections, I started seeing patterns in the friendship I'd been blind to. The way I'd been playing rescuer to their victim, the way they'd been playing superior to my inferior, the way we'd been mutually enabling each other's avoidance of authentic growth. When I stopped playing my role, when I set boundaries and started being honest about my observations, the friendship collapsed. They accused me of changing, of becoming cold, of abandoning them, and they were right. I had changed. I was no longer willing to maintain a friendship based on unconscious dynamics. I was no longer available to play rescuer. I was no longer content with superficial connection that avoided real intimacy. The loss was devastating. For months, I questioned whether I was wrong, whether I'd become heartless, whether individuation was worth the cost of losing people I loved. But eventually, I understood. I didn't lose a real friendship. I lost a projection system that had been masquerading as friendship. The actual person and I had never been in genuine relationship because we'd both been too unconscious to see each other clearly. This is the grief of relationship upheaval, not just mourning the loss of the person, but mourning the death of who you were in that relationship. Mourning the fantasy of who you thought they were. Mourning the innocence of unconscious connection. Because once you've seen clearly, you can't unsee. Once projections collapse, you can't resurrect them. Once you've tasted authentic relating, you can't go back to unconscious performance. The gift, and it is a gift, though it doesn't feel like one during the crisis, is that relationship upheaval clears space for genuine connection. Once you've withdrawn your projections, once you've integrated your contrasexual archetype, once you've stopped needing others to complete you, you become capable of actual intimacy. Actual intimacy means seeing and being seen without projection. It means loving the real person, not your fantasy of them. It means being loved for who you actually are, not who you're performing as. It means staying in relationship through conflict, through change, through the death of old forms and the birth of new ones. Most people never experience actual intimacy because they're too terrified of being seen. They'd rather maintain projection systems, comfortable lies, mutual performances. But soul evolution strips away that option. It forces you into authenticity, and authentic relating, while more vulnerable, is infinitely more alive than unconscious comfort. If you're experiencing relationship upheaval right now, If your marriage is crumbling, if your friendships are dissolving, if your family relationships are becoming intolerable, ask yourself, am I losing actual connection or am I losing projection systems? Am I being abandoned or are my relationships transforming to match my transformation? The answer isn't always clear. Sometimes genuine connection does end because paths genuinely diverge. But often what feels like loss is actually liberation from unconscious contracts, from limiting roles, from relationships that were never actually intimate but which felt comfortable because they were familiar. The fifth symptom of soul evolution, relationship upheaval, is your psyche's way of destroying connections built on false foundations so that authentic connection becomes possible. It's painful, disorienting, and often lonely, but it's necessary because you cannot individuate in unconscious relationships. You cannot become whole while playing a partial role. You cannot evolve your soul while maintaining contracts that require you to stay small, stay stuck, stay asleep. The mirror is shattering. The projections are collapsing. The unconscious agreements are dissolving. And in the rubble of what falls apart, there's space for something real to finally be built. After your relationships have been torn apart, after you've lost the people who helped you maintain your unconscious identity, after you've been stripped of the external supports that kept you from facing yourself, something else often happens. Your body breaks down, not metaphorically, but literally. You get sick, chronic pain that doctors can't explain, autoimmune conditions that emerge suddenly, fatigue so profound you can barely function, mysterious symptoms that Western medicine labels as idiopathic, which is medical terminology for we don't know what's causing this. This is the sixth symptom of soul evolution, physical illness as psychic message. And it's the symptom that Western materialism struggles most to accept, because it suggests that consciousness and body aren't separate, that psychological wounds can manifest as physical symptoms, that the psyche will use the body as its final messenger when all other communications have been ignored. Jung was radical in his understanding of psychosomatic illness. He wrote, "It is a well-known fact that physical symptoms can be the expression of psychic disturbances." But he went further than this. He suggested that when the psyche needs to communicate something urgent, something the conscious mind is refusing to acknowledge, it will bypass mental symptoms entirely and create physical crisis, because physical illness forces you to stop. It demands attention. It makes denial impossible. Let me tell you about Elena. Elena was 36, a successful marketing executive who'd spent her entire adult life climbing the corporate ladder with ruthless focus. She was brilliant at her job, strategic, tireless, capable of handling pressure that would break most people. She worked 12-hour days, answered emails at midnight, sacrificed weekends and vacations for projects and pitches. Everyone admired her dedication, her work ethic, her apparent invincibility. But Elena had been ignoring something for years, a deep, gnawing sense that her life was wrong. Not just unsatisfying, but fundamentally misaligned with something essential in her being. She felt it most acutely on Sunday evenings, when the dread of Monday morning would settle into her chest like a physical weight. But she'd learned to push through it, to tell herself that everyone feels this way, that this is just what adult life requires, that meaning comes from achievement and security, not from some nebulous concept of authenticity. Then, 3 months after she'd ignored her soul's quiet whisper, 3 months after she'd rejected the synchronicities pointing her toward change, 3 months after she'd dismissed the dreams showing her trapped in burning buildings, her body staged a coup. She woke up one morning and couldn't move her left arm. No pain, no injury, just paralysis. By noon, she'd lost feeling in her left leg. By evening, she was in the emergency room undergoing every neurological test available. MRI, CT scan, spinal tap, blood work, everything came back normal. The neurologist looked at her with a mixture of confusion and subtle skepticism and said the words that would change everything. "Ms. Reyes, there's nothing physically wrong with you that we can find. This might be psychosomatic." Elena's first response was rage. How dare this doctor suggest she was making it up, that it was all in her head, that she was somehow choosing to be paralyzed. But the doctor clarified, psychosomatic doesn't mean fake. It means your psyche is expressing itself through your soma, your body. Something psychological is manifesting physically. You're not imagining the paralysis, it's real, but the cause isn't neurological, it's psychological. The paralysis lasted 2 weeks. During that time, Elena couldn't work, couldn't drive, couldn't maintain her relentless pace. She was forced into stillness, into dependency, into helplessness, everything her ego had spent decades avoiding. And in that enforced stillness, something began to surface. Memories, feelings, realizations. She remembered being 7 years old, telling her father she wanted to be an artist. His face hardening, his voice cold. "Artists are poor. You'll do something practical." She remembered choosing business school not because she loved business, but because it was safe, respectable, guaranteed income. She remembered every moment she'd betrayed her own impulses to gain approval, security, or status. She remembered the painting supplies she'd thrown away at 18, the creativity she'd murdered to become the person her family could be proud of. Her body had created the exact symptom her psyche needed. Paralysis. She couldn't move forward in the life she'd been living. Her body was forcing what her mind couldn't admit. That she was already paralyzed, had been for years, trapped in a life that was killing her soul, inch by inch. When the paralysis finally lifted, gradually, mysteriously, as suddenly as it had appeared, Elena made a choice her ego never would have made without the crisis. She quit her job, not impulsively, but consciously. She enrolled in art school. She moved to a smaller apartment, accepted a massive pay cut, chose aliveness over safety. Years later, she told me, "My body saved my life by shutting it down. I wouldn't have listened any other way." This is what Jung meant by the body as the unconscious made visible. Your psyche isn't contained in your brain. It extends through your entire organism. Every organ, every system, every cell carries psychological meaning. And when consciousness becomes too rigid, when the ego refuses to hear the soul's messages through dreams, synchronicities, or shadow eruptions, the psyche will use the body to force the conversation. Jung studied the connection between psyche and soma extensively, particularly through his work with patients experiencing conversion disorders, psychological conflicts converting into physical symptoms. He found that certain kinds of psychological material would consistently manifest in specific physical locations. Throat issues, chronic sore throats, thyroid problems, loss of voice, often correlated with unexpressed truth, things that needed to be said but were being swallowed. The throat is the passage between inner and outer, between thought and speech. When that passage is blocked psychologically, it often becomes blocked physically. Digestive issues, IBS, chronic nausea, stomach pain, often correlated with inability to digest experiences, to process and metabolize what life was presenting. People who couldn't set boundaries, who took in too much from others, who absorbed others' emotions, they often developed digestive disorders that mirrored their psychological inability to discriminate between what nourishes and what poisons. Chronic fatigue, the bone-deep exhaustion that sleep doesn't touch, often correlated with what Jung called soul fatigue, the exhaustion of living inauthentically, of maintaining a persona that requires constant energy to sustain. When you're living a false life, when you're constantly performing rather than being, The energy drain is immense. Eventually, the body forces rest by making activity impossible. Autoimmune conditions, where the body attacks itself, often correlated with self-rejection, internalized shame, the psyche quite literally turning against itself. Jung noticed that patients with autoimmune issues almost universally struggled with severe self-criticism, perfectionism, and inability to accept their own humanity. The immune system was doing on a physical level what the psyche was doing on a psychological level, attacking itself for not being good enough. Now, I need to be absolutely clear about something. This understanding is not permission to blame sick people for their illness. It's not New Age nonsense about you created your disease with your thoughts. And it's not reason to dismiss medical treatment or pretend physical illness is just psychological. Jung was emphatic about this. Psychosomatic reality and biological reality coexist. Just because an illness has psychological components doesn't mean it's not physically real or doesn't require medical treatment. The psyche-soma connection is far more nuanced than simplistic mind creates matter thinking. What Jung discovered is this: psychological conflicts that can't be resolved consciously will often find expression through the body. But once they've become physical, they require both psychological and physical intervention. You can't just think your way out of autoimmune disease, but you also can't heal completely if you only treat the body while ignoring the psyche's message. The somatic symbol. Decoder Jung developed helps distinguish between purely physical illness and illness with significant psychological components. Signal 1. Mysterious onset. The illness appears suddenly without clear physical cause. No infection, no injury, no genetic predisposition doctors can identify. It emerges as if from nowhere, which often means it emerged from the unconscious. Signal 2. Medical confusion. Tests come back inconclusive or normal. Doctors are puzzled. Different specialists give different diagnoses. Treatment doesn't work as expected. This suggests the root cause isn't purely physical. Signal 3. Symbolic timing. The illness appears at a psychologically significant moment, right when you're about to make a major change, right when you're avoiding a crucial decision, right when unconscious material is trying to surface. Elena's paralysis appeared exactly when she needed to stop moving forward in her current direction. Signal 4. Symbolic location. The physical symptom mirrors the psychological conflict. Heart problems when you can't access your emotions. Lung problems when you feel suffocated by life. Skin problems when you have boundary issues. Reproductive problems when you're conflicted about creativity or sexuality. The body speaks in metaphor. Signal 5. Resistance to treatment. Physical interventions help temporarily, but the symptoms return. Medication manages but doesn't cure. Surgery addresses one manifestation, but another symptom appears elsewhere. The body keeps finding new ways to express what the psyche needs to say. Signal 6. Spontaneous resolution. Sometimes after psychological work or life change, physical symptoms disappear as mysteriously as they appeared. Not because they were fake, but because once the psyche's message was received and honored, the physical expression was no longer necessary. Elena's paralysis showed all 6 signals. Sudden onset, medical confusion, appeared right when she needed to stop. Symbolically reflected her psychological paralysis, didn't respond to physical treatment, and resolved once she made changes aligned with her soul's need. But here's where this gets complex and where most people misunderstand. The body doesn't create illness to punish you. It creates illness to communicate with you, to protect you, to force the changes your ego is refusing to make. Think about it. Elena's paralysis was brutal, but it was also merciful. If her body hadn't forced her to stop, she would have continued in that soul-killing job for decades. She would have had a heart attack at 50 or developed cancer at 55, illness that would have been far more devastating than temporary paralysis. Her psyche intervened early with reversible symptoms to prevent irreversible damage. This is the protective function of psychosomatic illness. It's the psyche's emergency brake, pulling you out of danger when you won't pull yourself out. It's painful, disruptive, frightening, but it's also intelligent, it's purposeful. It's the soul saying, I will force you to pay attention because ignoring this will eventually kill you. Jung wrote extensively about what he called creative illness, illness that serves transformation. He documented how many of his patients' most profound psychological breakthroughs came through or after physical crisis, not because illness is good, but because illness forces confrontation with mortality, with limitation, with the reality that you are not invincible and your time is finite. That confrontation can catalyze profound change. During his own break with Freud, Jung experienced significant physical symptoms: heart palpitations, dizziness, fainting spells. His doctor found nothing wrong physically. Jung realized his body was manifesting the psychological crisis of separating from his mentor and facing his own unconscious material. The symptoms didn't resolve until he completed his descent into the Red Book material, until he'd integrated what his psyche was demanding he face. Now, let me share something personal that's difficult to admit. During my own soul evolution crisis, I developed chronic pain in my jaw, TMJ so severe I couldn't eat solid food for weeks. Dentists found no physical cause, but through active imagination work, I realized what my body was expressing. I'd been clenching my jaw for years, literally holding back words I needed to say, swallowing rage I was afraid to express, grinding my teeth through situations that should have made me scream. My jaw had become the physical container for all my unexpressed anger, all my swallowed truth. And eventually, that container cracked. The pain forced me to stop talking so much. I'd been hiding behind words, using intellectual discourse to avoid genuine feeling. The pain forced me into stillness, into silence, into finally feeling what I'd been talking around for years. I worked with both a physical therapist and a therapist. The physical work provided relief but didn't solve it. The psychological work, finally expressing the rage, finally speaking the truths I'd been afraid to voice, finally allowing my authentic feelings rather than my curated thoughts. That's what ultimately resolved the jaw pain. My body stopped needing to hold what my psyche was finally willing to express. This is the integration that psychosomatic healing requires, honoring both the physical symptom and the psychological message. Not either or, but both and. Use medical intervention for symptom relief, while doing psychological work to address the root cause. The body dialogue technique Jung used is powerful for accessing what physical symptoms are trying to communicate. Step 1. Locate the symptom. Sit quietly and bring your attention to the area of physical distress. Don't try to fix it or make it go away. Just notice it. What does it feel like? Heavy, tight, burning, numb. What's the specific quality of the sensation? Step 2. Personify the symptom. Give the symptom a voice, a form, a presence. If your pain could speak, what would it say? If your illness had a face, what would it look like? Let an image emerge spontaneously. Step 3. Dialogue. Ask the symptom, what are you trying to tell me? What do you need me to understand? What am I not hearing? And then listen. Let responses arise from your body, not your thinking mind. The answer might come as words, images, feelings, or sudden knowing. Step 4. Honor the message. Once you understand what the body is expressing, the crucial question becomes, are you willing to change your life in response? Are you willing to stop doing what's harming you? Are you willing to start doing what your soul needs? The body's message is useless unless you act on it. Step 5. Gratitude and negotiation. Thank your body for the communication, even if the symptom is painful. Then negotiate. I understand what you're saying. I commit to making changes. Can we work together on healing now? This isn't magical thinking. It's re-establishing conscious relationship with your somatic intelligence. Elena did this work during her paralysis. She dialogued with her immobile limbs, and they told her, "We will not move in the direction you've been going. We refuse to carry you toward death. Choose life and we'll help you walk toward it." The message was clear, unambiguous, and impossible to misinterpret. When she quit her job and chose authenticity over security, her body began functioning again, not as reward for good behavior, but because the psyche's message had been received and honored. The physical symptom was no longer necessary. Now, I want to address the shadow side of this understanding, the ways it gets misused in spiritual and wellness communities, the toxic belief that you create your own reality, or illness is a choice, or if you were truly spiritual, you wouldn't get sick. This is dangerous, victim-blaming nonsense that adds shame to suffering. Jung never suggested that all illness is psychosomatic. He never claimed you could heal anything through psychology alone. He never blamed sick people for being sick. What he said was more nuanced. Some illnesses have significant psychological components, and addressing those components alongside medical treatment can support healing. But some illnesses are purely physical, some are genetic, some are environmental, and not everything means something. The discernment comes through paying attention to the 6 signals I mentioned earlier. If your illness shows those patterns, mysterious onset, symbolic timing, resistance to treatment, then investigating psychological components makes sense. But if you have a bacterial infection, you need antibiotics, not shadow work. If you break your leg, you need medical care, not dream analysis. Physical reality is real. Don't spiritually bypass medical treatment. What makes psychosomatic illness so challenging is that it exists in the liminal space between mind and matter, between consciousness and biology, between what we can control and what we can't. It forces us to hold paradox. The illness is real, and it has psychological meaning. You didn't consciously choose it, and your psyche is expressing something through it. You need medical treatment, and you need psychological integration. Jung called this the psychoid realm, the domain where psyche and matter aren't yet differentiated, where psychological and physical are still one reality. Most people try to collapse this paradox, choosing either pure materialism, it's only physical, or pure idealism, it's only mental. But Jung insisted on holding the tension. Body and psyche are distinct but inseparable, different aspects of one unified reality we don't fully understand. This understanding transforms how you relate to illness. Instead of seeing your body as betraying you, you can see it as communicating with you. Instead of fighting symptoms, you can listen to them. Instead of viewing illness as random misfortune, you can investigate whether it carries meaning, not because you caused it, but because your psyche might be using it to get your attention. Elena's story has a sequel. 5 years after her paralysis, she developed breast cancer, hormone positive, caught early, treatable. She went through surgery and treatment. But she also did psychological work, exploring what breast cancer, connected to nurturing, femininity, giving, might be reflecting in her psyche. What she discovered was that even after leaving corporate life, even after becoming an artist, she'd recreated the same patterns. She was giving everything to her art, to her students, to others, while neglecting her own needs. She was nurturing everyone except herself. Her body was saying, the issue isn't what career you have, it's how you relate to yourself. Stop depleting yourself. Start mothering yourself. The cancer treatment was successful. But the real healing came from changing her relationship with self-nurturing, with receiving, with allowing herself to be cared for instead of always being the caregiver. The illness was both a physical reality requiring medical intervention and a psychological message requiring life change. Both and not either or. The sixth symptom of soul evolution, physical illness as psychic message, is perhaps the most controversial because it challenges our culture's strict separation between mind and body, psychology and biology, meaning and matter. But Jung's insight remains. We are not brains piloting meat suits. We are unified psychosomatic beings, and what affects one dimension affects all dimensions. Your body is not your enemy. It's not punishing you for being unconscious. It's trying desperately to get your attention, using the only language it has when words fail: sensation, symptom, breakdown. And during soul evolution, when unconscious material is flooding toward consciousness, when your entire being is reorganizing itself, the body often becomes the battlefield where that reorganization happens. If you're experiencing unexplained physical symptoms right now, if doctors are confused, if treatments aren't working, if your body seems to be rebelling against you, I'm not telling you it's all in your head. I'm not suggesting you skip medical care. What I'm suggesting is this: alongside medical treatment, ask your body what it's trying to tell you. Ask your symptoms what they're expressing. Ask your illness what it needs you to understand about your life. The answer might surprise you. It might demand changes you're not ready to make. It might reveal truths you've been avoiding. But it might also be the key to healing that medical treatment alone can't provide. Your body is speaking. The question is, are you listening? Are you willing to honor its message? Are you willing to change your life in response to its wisdom? Because sometimes the body breaks down so the soul can break through. Sometimes illness is the crisis that finally forces the transformation consciousness alone couldn't achieve. Sometimes the body rebels because it's the only way to stop you from killing your soul. The sixth symptom is painful, frightening, and potentially dangerous, but it's also intelligent, purposeful, and potentially transformative. Listen to your body, honor its messages, and let it guide you toward the life your soul has been demanding all along.